Dark. An alien sci-fi romance. Book 7 in the Colony, Nick series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Your 9 o'clock is here, Dr. Dark. Mr. Falconhahn, Titan, Kestrel Shifter. His file is on your tablet, said the clinic receptionist. Tariq nodded, wishing he could remember her name. He hadn't worked with her before, and as she hadn't introduced herself, all he could say was, "Thank you." It seemed to suffice. Tariq always enjoyed his days in the GP clinic. He hadn't practiced general medicine since before he left Tito, but there were so few doctors in the colony that everyone took a turn on the roster. Especially as every colonist was required to have regular health checks, both mental and physical. Falcon shuffled into the treatment room, looking like he had to force every step. Then he looked up and caught Tariq's eye. "Dr. Dark. Fancy seeing you here." "How are you flying, Falcon?" Tariq asked, gesturing for Falcon to take a seat. "Couldn't be better. I'm going to be a dad." He might be in his human form, but Falcon still puffed up like a proud kestrel. "Congratulations. When's the baby due?" 6 months to go, but I can't wait." "So early days yet." Tariq remembered that initial excitement, before the morning sickness set in. "I'll bet. Now let's get started with your health check. You'll want to be as fit and healthy as possible, if you're going to be running around after a little. I'm all yours, Doc. I've been waiting all my life for this. Not going to mess this up." Falcon stripped down to his underwear and lay down on the examination table. The table itself did most of the scanning, but in Tariq's experience, old-fashioned doctoring didn't hurt, especially when he wanted to be thorough. "Experiencing any unusual pain or discomfort?" Tariq asked, taking Falcon's pulse. It was fast, but the man was excited about his good news, so perhaps that wasn't surprising. Still, he added a detailed heart scan to the table's list of tasks. "Just a bit of indigestion. Eating too fast. You know how it is, when work's busy and you only have a moment to eat, you stuff it down and get back to work." Tariq nodded. It had been a long time since he'd had to do that, but Falcon was getting forgetful in his old age. While Tariq, well, he didn't age. The scanner beeped an alert. Not surprising for a man of Falcon's age, but no less concerning. Tariq reached for his tablet to view the results, only to find his fingers went right through the device. Cursing, he tried again. On the second try, he managed to grasp the tablet so that he could lift it up. What he saw filled his ethereal heart with dread. "Falcon, did you have a run-in with any robots before you left Tito?" Tariq asked carefully. It was the only explanation. How he could have missed it. Falcon laughed. "You mean I didn't tell you that story? It's a good one too. I ran a spaceport bar on Tito, before the robot rebellion. No, not the fancy departure lounge one for passengers. The sort of place space freighter crews hung out at, before and after a long haul out to the asteroid belt. Where smugglers and the like made deals to carry cargo and passengers that they didn't want the Central Intelligence to know about. It goes without saying that I didn't allow robots in there, so when one walked in the middle of the day, just after we'd opened, before any customers had come in, I took one look at it and said, 'We don't serve your kind here. Get out,' but the thing just stood there and didn't budge. So I got out the laser rifle I kept behind the bar for those occasions when the bar got a little rough, and told it again to get out or be destroyed. Instead of going away, it came closer. The eyes on it sort of glowed red, almost like twin lasers, which distracted me, you know? That's why I didn't notice it lift its arm up and extend it toward me, until it hit me with what felt like a cattle prod, all electricity and sparks and stuff. Hurt like a mother, it did. So there I am, shaking at all the power it's pumping into me, and my vision starts to go black like I'm some fainting flower, and I remember the gun in my hand. With the last of my strength, I lifted it up, my vision totally tunneling on those glowing red eyes, and I lasered them right out of its head. Actually, I took off the whole top of its head, but I didn't find out until about an hour later, when a couple of customers came in and found me lying on the floor. A few free drinks, and they agreed to dispose of the robot for me. I went back to serving drinks like any other afternoon, wondering if the Central Intelligence would send someone after me for destroying one of its robots, but it never came. The next day it went mad, assassinating the president and killing a whole bunch of other people. You and your family too, I heard, but I guess they got that wrong, seeing as you made it here. Makes me wonder if me shooting that robot was what set off the whole rebellion. Tariq shook his head. My family didn't make it. In a way, nor had he, but even Tariq couldn't explain how his ghost had gotten up and gone to work, becoming a poltergeist without even realizing it. But he shook his head. Now wasn't the time for maudlin memories or mourning. He needed to save Falcon. Why didn't you report the attack, or go to a hospital for a checkup? Falcon just laughed. Me? I was fine. Worked a whole shift behind the bar until closing time, no worries. I didn't need a hospital, or any record that might get back to the Central Intelligence. I didn't want to get sentenced to hard labor on some mining ship for destroying public property. If I hadn't been able to work, I wouldn't have gotten off planet during the evacuation either. As it was, I got offered a place on a smuggling ship, courtesy of Hera herself. Yes, that did sound like Falcon. Except, those who had reported to hospital with robot-related injuries had been evacuated faster than almost anyone else, because they needed to be placed in the stasis pods aboard the Titanic. In stasis, their conditions wouldn't deteriorate, giving surgeons the time to repair the damage or grow organ replacements. It had taken years of the voyage for the limited number of cardiologists to save everyone they could, while the other refugees slept. In the end, all of the others had entered stasis, except Tariq, who'd chosen cardiology as his specialization, what with the desperate need for them and all. And seeing as ghosts didn't need stasis pods or even sleep, he hadn't needed to stop until all the transplants were complete. By that time, the Titanic had almost reached its destination in the Alton system. Which was why seeing the damage to Falcon's heart now untreated hit him so hard. If Falcon had come to him on Tito, Tariq could have saved him. But now, the robot damaged your heart, Falcon. I saw this a lot during the rebellion. Those cattle prods they used for crowd control had been modified somehow to increase the current so that instead of just delivering a mild, painful shock, they could stop a man's heart. Or fatally damage it. I lost count of the number of heart transplants I had to perform. Without the stasis pods and advanced labs on the Titanic, we never would have been able to grow enough stem cells to replace them all. Stasis pods they'd also lost during the war, when humans had sunk the Titanic. Fear flashed across Falcon's face for a brief second, before he hitched his grin back. You're going to grow me a whole new heart? Perfect. I'll need a new ticker, if I'm going to be chasing around after my son. I've been looking at buying a cabin in the Arbor Dome, to give him space to fly. If he can fly. The mother's human, so he might not get my wings, but back on Tito, shifter blood bred true more often than not, right? Tariq found himself nodding. Shifter traits do tend to be genetically dominant, and many shifters have chosen to live in the Arbor Dome, or the Ag Dome. Those that haven't chosen to terraform the inner planets, of course. Falcon nodded, never losing his happy grin. So, how soon do you want me under the knife for this new heart? Before the baby comes, I hope. Sometimes, being a doctor was the hardest job in the world. If you'd come to me earlier, I'd have been able to tell you you'll be fully recovered by the time the baby's born. But now, I'm not even sure if you have the 3 months it'll take to grow you a new heart, Falcon. That robot really did a number on you." The naked terror on Falcon's face would have broken Tariq's heart, if he still had one. "Tell me there's something you can do for me, Doc," he begged. "I can give you some prescriptions that might help, and give you more time. But you'll have to take it easy. No strenuous activity, not even with that young wife of yours. Nothing that gets your heart racing or even beating fast. So stay away from horror movies, too. If you're afraid of spiders, it's time to call pest control. I'll talk to Region and see about growing you a new heart, but I can't make any promises, Falcon. You'll have to hang on and survive. I can only do so much." Falcon seized Tariq's hand in both of his and shook it fiercely. "Thanks, Doc. I'll do everything you say. Anything to see my son." He hurried out, and Tariq could only shake his head. Sometimes, Tariq wished he'd died right alongside his family, so that he might be with them in some form of afterlife. Most of the time, he knew he'd done the right thing, being too stubborn to accept his own death, because by doing so, he'd saved the lives of countless others. His late wife Rhoda would have been proud, and baby girl Mira. He might not have been able to save her from the heart defect she'd been born with, but every life he'd saved since had been in her name. But now, no matter how many lives he'd saved, he'd failed Falcon. Because no matter how fast the techs in the regeneration could grow him a new heart, Tariq knew it wouldn't be fast enough to save Falcon. Still, he had to try. Poltergeists only existed when they had purpose, unfinished business they needed to take care of. Because if he couldn't save lives, did he even have a purpose anymore? Everything smelled wrong. Worse, it smelled like that time, back in the foster home, that one of the boys had gotten hold of a box of matches and set fire to the curtains while she was asleep, and she'd woken up in hospital, her throat raw like she'd eaten hot coals. Smoke inhalation, one of the nurses had said, in a whisper Linnaea probably wasn't supposed to have heard, before she'd been sent off to a different foster home, where, instead of a firebug, she'd shared a room with a girl who woke up screaming, "The police are coming," in the middle of the night, before flushing everything down the toilet, until it blocked and overflowed. Linnaea shuddered at the memory of those soaked, slimy carpets. This time her throat was just dry. "Water," she whispered. "Oh, you're awake. That's wonderful," a cheerful voice chirped, almost like she meant it. Linnaea blinked at the woman, whose smile shone all the way up to her eyes. Maybe she did mean it. That would be a first. "Who are you?" Linnaea rasped. The woman reached for a jug of water and poured a cup, before handing it to Linnaea. "I'm Maya, head midwife here at New Hope Hospital. And yes, before you ask, the babies are absolutely fine. It's you we need to worry about. I mean, fainting in early pregnancy is fairly normal, but can you tell me the last time you ate and managed to keep the food down?" Linnaea sipped the water. Cool and fresh, and before she knew it, she'd gulped down the last of it. "No," she admitted. "I knew there'd be morning sickness, but I didn't know I'd still be sick in the afternoon and sometimes even the evening too." Maya tsked. "Thought so. That's why I have you hooked up to an IV line, giving you all the nutrients you need, plus some anti-nausea medication that other patients said has worked wonders. Oh, and the food. The hospital gets more than its fair share of the harvests here at the colony, so the food here is some of the best in the whole Alton system. Maybe not quite as good as the chefs can create in Forge, seeing as they're the best, and I have yet to see any lobster on the menu, but we get the same stuff in the staff canteen, and it's definitely one of the perks of working here." She took the cup from Linnaea, refilled it, and handed it back. "You need to keep your fluids up too. Now, seeing as you'll need to be here for a little while under observation before I can release you, what do you prefer to be called?" "We can stick with Linnaea. unless you have a nickname you prefer." Linnaea shook her head. "I was in and out of foster homes for most of my life until I came here. My name was the only thing I had, so I held on to it as hard as I could. And it was the one thing Brinley couldn't burn, and Leanne couldn't flush down the toilet. And now she had a baby, hers alone, that she'd hold on to tighter than anything else she ever had before. No way was she going to let her baby go into the system. She'd do everything she could for this baby. Stay in a bed with an IV in her arm, and eat nutrient soup for the whole 9 months, if that's what the midwife made her do." Midwife Maya, whose genuine smile seemed too good to be true. "Are you an alien?" Linnaea asked, squinting at her. Not that she'd met more than the one who'd fathered her child, and even then she'd barely seen him. Maya laughed. "Nope. I did get kidnapped by one though. An absolute asshole, who totally deserved to get thrown out the airlock. I only wish I'd had the presence of mind to castrate him first. Then again, I'm sure those bits froze off once he hit vacuum, so it's probably better that I didn't have to touch them. Since I arrived in the colony though, I have met quite a number of lovely aliens I'm pleased to call my colleagues, neighbors, patients, friends, oh, and even my husband." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I must admit, I like having a completely human patient though. Because while most Titan ladies look human, once they go into labor, well, we all lose control a little bit, and that's when the claws or tentacles come out, let me tell you." Linnaea's mouth fell open and couldn't seem to close. "Tentacles," she said faintly. Maya looked embarrassed. It's considered poor form to ask a Titan what sort of creature they are, so when she presented at the emergency department, already in labor, and demanding a water birth, I was more concerned about finding out if we had the facilities for that, than why she wanted it. Of course, the facilities in the colony are some of the best in the galaxy, so I found an absolutely enormous tub that looked like it was designed for water deliveries, and set about seeing that it was made ready for her. By the time she arrived from emergency, I only had a moment for handover, where the doctor said something about the patient wanting a traditional water delivery, but wasn't sure if it would be safe due to the nature of the baby's father, so she'd been sent here from the Aqua Dome. Anyway, the father was part of the terraforming team on Delta, so he wasn't able to attend the birth. That should have told me something, that the man was a Titan, and the child was likely a hybrid of some sort, but I was more focused on keeping the mother calm and managing her pain levels. We tried to run a scan, but the birth proceeded too quickly, and we had to get her into the water. She kept talking about her babies, so I assumed it was a multiple birth, which she indicated was normal in her family." Maya glanced at Linnaea as if sizing her up for something before continuing. "It was quick and relatively painless, on her part at least, though one of the orderlies did end up with bruised ribs when one of her tentacles wrapped around him and squeezed too tight. She only had the one baby to her surprise, and the child had wings. She was a Kraken shifter, who usually give birth to large numbers of young that remained in the water in their tentacled form for some time after birth, but her partner was an albatross shifter, which only have single children. This baby had taken after its father, and she was most displeased to be born by water birth." Maya smiled fondly. "Strong lungs on that one, but 3 hearts just like her mum." Linnaea touched her belly. "When will I be able to find out if it's a boy or a girl? Or a squid?" Maya grinned. "Usually at about 20 weeks, when those bits are developed enough to show up on a scan. Sometimes the scan doesn't show everything though, or the results can be wrong, and you won't find out until the actual birth, like Mrs. Albatross Kraken." "Oh." Maya leaned forward and winked. "But if you want to see them, I can bring the ultrasound in here, and we can do a scan just for fun if you like. You never know what we might see." Linnaea's heart leaped. She might not know midwife Maya very well, but the woman was already well on her way to being her favorite person in the galaxy. Yes, please. Tariq pulled the stethoscope down from his ears. Congratulations. You have a very healthy human child, he said. But there's a slight echo there that might be arrhythmia, and I want to be sure. I'd like to do a full ECG on him. If there is anything irregular about his heart, it's best to know as early as possible, so we can discuss treatment options before he suffers any ill effects. Not that I think there is, but I want to be sure. Would you mind? Tariq asked. Just to make sure. Of course, Maya said. She held Christos out to the doctor. Be my guest. Separated from the warmth of his mother's arms, the baby screwed up his face and began to wail. Maya checked her watch. Sorry, Tariq, I should probably feed him and put him down for a sleep. He's been rather cranky of late, not to mention not sleeping well. I think it might be time to start him on solid food instead of just milk. I'll tell you what. Next week, Ghost's on duty and I have night shift, so pop down to the hospital creche, who keep him overnight when we're both working. I'll add your name to the list of people who are authorized to collect him, so you can come down any time, borrow him and bring him back when you're done. Or even bring the ECG down to him. More often than not, he's the only baby in the creche at night. I'll mention it to her. Oh no, she's just on maternity leave. I guess I'll tell the replacement night staff when I meet them. Tariq nodded. Thank you, I will. He handed the baby to his father, who soon had the child smiling again. Then Ghost put his arm around Maya and the little family walked out of the clinic, the epitome of wedded bliss. Tariq sighed, then followed them out, wishing with all his might for everything he'd lost. Sure, Gulmira had been far more delicate than the robust Christos, likely because Rhoda was one of the Anthusi, but he'd loved them and tried to protect them just as fiercely as Ghost did for his family. But where he'd failed, Ghost had succeeded, and now he got to enjoy the kind of happiness Tariq wished he could know for even one more moment. He sighed again and leaned against the wall. Or he would have if his hand hadn't gone straight through the wall, followed by the rest of him, so now all he could see was the grain of the plascrete, until he managed to find a way out of the wall again. Maybe he really was fading, and one day soon he'd get to see his family again. Tariq stepped out of the wall and righted himself, in the hope that no one would notice that he was any different to the other doctors in New Hope Hospital, except for the faint, ghostly glow that clung to him. The glow that had made one of the nurses remark, "Doctor, you glow in the dark," and resulted in everyone calling him Dr. Dark instead of his real name. If he could only hear Rhoda call him Tariq one more time. One day. But first, he still held out hope he'd have time to perform Falcon's heart transplant, so his friend could experience the joy of holding his son in his arms. Now that was worth living for. As the ultrasound wand pressed hard against Linnaea's belly, she squirmed and wished she hadn't drunk so much water beforehand. Or that she'd paused to pay a visit to the bathroom. Wow, it sounds like they're having a dance party in there, Maya said with a laugh. Luckily, they're too small for you to be able to feel them moving yet. And too small to see if it's a him or a her, Linnaea said wistfully. Well, yes, but the more they grow, the more crowded it'll get, so you might have to wait and be surprised at birth. If it's really important to you, we could always take a sample of the amniotic fluid and send it for DNA testing, but I don't recommend it, unless we suspect something's seriously wrong in there, and there's a high chance you'll lose the baby anyway, because even taking the sample is risky for you and the baby. Linnaea touched a hand to her tummy. No. Don't do anything that might hurt them. Maya nodded, then let out a squeal as she pointed at the screen. Look, there they are. Linnaea squinted at it, but all she could see was a couple of round blobs. What am I looking at? Two heads, of course. Linnaea's blood ran cold. My baby has two heads? In what universe was having two heads normal? Maya laughed merrily as if nothing was wrong. No, of course not. There's the body of baby number 1, stretching out, while baby number 2 is curled up, probably to make space for 1. And baby number 3, yep, there it is. Right up the top, looking down on the other 2, sucking its thumb. Now Linnaea thought she was going to be sick. I'm having 3 babies? It wasn't possible. Yup. You're carrying an instant family of triplets, right here. Chances are, you'll probably have at least one of each too, so even if they do keep their legs crossed for every scan, it won't really matter. You and their dad are going to be really busy running after these 3. Linnaea swallowed. Maya's smile and good humor were going to vanish in a judgmental storm of disapproval. She just knew it. But she didn't want to lie, either. Their dad's not really in the picture anymore. Even if he hadn't died, he was still just a sperm donor as far as she was concerned. Maya's smile only widened. Did you push him out the airlock too? Linnaea spluttered. No. She couldn't imagine pushing someone out into the cold vacuum of space. That would kill them for sure. She might not have liked the father of her kids, or even known much about him, but she hadn't wished him dead. Maya shrugged. Well, technically, I don't know if he was my son's father. I couldn't tell you who his DNA came from at all, including if any of mine made up part of his genome. But I did carry him to term, which makes him mine, and my husband is the best dad he could ever have. Maybe he'll even persuade me to try for a little brother or sister for him, who knows? She winked. I should ask him if there are any other protective single types where he works that might do for you. He works in emergency services, and they're all about saving people. Whether they're single, though. Linnaea shook her head. I'm not interested in dating until after the baby. No babies are born. Maya set her hands on her hips. Why the fuck not? It's not like you'll have a moment to yourself after they're born. Now's the only time you have, so you should make the most of it. Ooh, I heard of this intergalactic dating agency service, where they help you find a compatible partner who wants to have a family with you. You do speed dating, meeting a whole bunch of possible partners, and pick who you'd like to maybe meet up with again. Linnaea couldn't help it. She laughed. The intergalactic dating agency is how I wound up pregnant in the first place. That's the last place I'd go looking for someone I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, or trust to take care of my kids. Oh. So they're all desperate and dateless and just looking to get girls knocked up. That doesn't sound very nice at all. Someone should report them to the Watch for False Advertising then. Linnaea thought of the other girls from Star Farm who'd found happiness with men they'd met at the one-shot cantina. It couldn't be false advertising when it had worked for half a dozen of them, at least. Not all of them. Some are really great guys, and some of the girls I work with found love there. To the point where they left the farm and moved in with them. That had to have been what happened with Eva. Everyone said she was missing, but Linnaea knew Eva wasn't the sort to sit around, waiting patiently for things to happen. She'd expected to meet up with some man in the colony, and when he hadn't come for her, Linnaea was certain Eva had run away from Star Farm to go looking for him. Maya's eyes widened. You work on a farm? She shook her head. No wonder you collapsed. Hard labor, hyperemesis gravidarum and triplets do not mix. Even once you're discharged, you cannot possibly go back to that. I forbid it. In fact, I should set the watch on your employer for allowing it. I'll put a note on your medical file myself right now, stating that you are only allowed light duties until you go on maternity leave. Actually, I could probably send a recommendation to colony administration that you start your maternity leave right now, so you can spend the rest of your pregnancy resting properly. You can't do that, If I can't work on the farm, they won't let me live there. I don't have anywhere or anyone else." Linnaea began to hyperventilate. She hadn't had a panic attack like this in ages, but there was no stopping this one. Good thing she was already in bed, because she'd pass out for sure. "Don't be silly. This is the colony. Every colonist is entitled to a place to live, courtesy of the colony administration. They'll just have to find you an apartment. One big enough for you and 3 babies." Linnaea shook her head. "No. The other girls promised they'd help with the baby once it's born. I have to go back to the farm then. They're all the family I have." Maya looked thoughtful. "But you'll still need a temporary apartment until the birth, and maybe for a few weeks after, depending on how quickly you recover from the delivery. We won't need to bother the housing office, then. You can stay at my place." Linnaea's breath caught in her throat. "I couldn't possibly impose on you like that. You barely know me." Maya laughed. "Oh, you won't be imposing at all. The apartment's empty. I live with my husband in our house in the Arbor Dome, but my job at the hospital came with an apartment in Metropolis City, which I've barely used. You'll have the whole place to yourself, as long as you need it." Linnea slumped against the bed, spent. She knew when she was beaten. "All right. Thank you," she said. She nodded as Maya finished the ultrasound, pointing out all sorts of baby anatomy, but Linnaea's mind wandered. Wandered too. Mostly about the alien who'd kidnapped Maya, before she'd kicked him out the airlock. Much like Eva, Maya didn't seem like the type who'd let herself get kidnapped. Either the alien had had a death wish, or he'd been really, really stupid. Maybe both. Definitely both. Linnea focused on Maya again. Midwife Maya, she reminded herself. A woman whose job it was to look after expectant mothers and their babies all the way through pregnancy, birth and beyond. If I do everything you say, then I'll be doing the best I possibly can for my babies, won't I? Linnea asked. Maya grinned. You bet. Oh, I knew you were going to be my favorite patient. I'll tell you what. I'll make sure the kitchen in my apartment is fully stocked, with only the best and freshest the colony can provide, so that as soon as we're confident your nutrient levels are normal and the anti-nausea meds are working, you can eat like a proper pregnant lady who's feeding 4. That sounded heavenly. Linnea nodded. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Dark to Ed. Paging Dr. Dark to Ed. Tariq almost thought he was imagining things, as it had been months since he'd had any patient emergencies to deal with, but the hospital intercom continued to blare his name, so he tore his eyes away from the stem cell culture tanks he'd been mindlessly watching in region and headed to the emergency department as ordered. It was amazing, really. Once they'd grown enough stem cells, one of the technicians would introduce heart cells from the transplant patient's own heart, and the entire culture would transform from an amorphous blob into a recognizable, functioning heart that even the patient's own body couldn't discern from their own. Less than 0.01% chance of rejection, with no need for immunosuppressants. The closest thing to a miracle he'd ever seen. He'd known about the technology back on Tito, but the costs involved were so high, he'd never met a patient who could afford this kind of transplant. Here, it was standard practice, and part of every citizen's right to free healthcare. Both his patients would have brand new hearts in a matter of months. He already had a tissue sample from Pollux, but he still needed one from Falcon. He'd call him in the morning and get him to come in, so Region could start building his heart. The new heart that would undoubtedly burst with love when he first held his son in his arms. Just as Tariq's had when he'd first seen Gulmira. If Gulmira had been born here, she'd have been able to live a normal, healthy life. But the universe had had other plans. I'm Dr. Dark, he said when he reached the nurse's station. "What have you got for me?" The nurse turned her dark-ringed eyes on him without really seeing him, as though it had been a long and stressful shift. She thrust a clipboard at him. Isolation Room 1. If Tariq had still possessed a heart, it would have sunk. The isolation room was used for suspected contagions, which they hadn't yet encountered her in the colony, thank the stars, or for child patients, so they weren't subject to the potential horrors of other patients' injuries. Seeing as there was no known contagion that affected the heart, that meant his patient must be some poor kid who'd lost the genetic lottery, just like Gulmira, and been born with a heart condition that had gone undiagnosed until now. Either that, or the poor kid had been electrocuted, which wasn't much better. He forced a smile onto his face as he breezed into the isolation room. "Hi, I'm Dr. Dark. How are you feeling today?" No response. Tariq looked down and realized why. He was the only person in the isolation room. Well, unless you counted the body bag lying on the gurney. Too big for the corpse to be a child, was his first thought, as his shoulders sagged in relief. Thank the universe for small mercies. Whoever it was, they'd at least had some semblance of a life before it ended. His fingers blurred as he reached for the zip. It took him a moment to realize it was actually his hands, shaking, that made them blur. They hadn't done that since he was alive. It was almost as if he didn't want to know who was in the body bag. Which made no sense. Rhoda and Gulmira were long gone, and while he'd seen plenty of death in his time as a doctor since, he'd never had a personal connection with any of them, aside from the professional relationship between a doctor and their patient. Tariq shook his head and yanked down the zip. Then jumped back, clapping his hands to his face in horror. "Stars," he swore, looking down on Falcon's definitely dead face. The man's eyes were closed, but no way could anyone think he was just sleeping. Between his horrified expression and the state of decay already visible on his face, there would be no saving Falcon. Region could only do so much, and there was nothing they could do for a man this dead, short of cloning him, but that would be as illegal here as it had been back on Tito. Without functional brain cells, to transfer from the original body to the clone anyway. And Falcon's brain was undoubtedly as dead as the rest of him. Tariq buried his head in his hands. Poor Falcon would never live to see his son, and those stem cells upstairs would be reassigned for something else. How could he have forgotten about Falcon? They'd gone to school together. Were even distant cousins on his mother's side, which made them family. The last family he had, until now. Maybe he should just let himself fade. If he couldn't even keep his family alive, what right did he have to still be here, when everyone he'd known and loved was gone? A strange chiming sound echoed through the apartment, coming from everywhere all at once, so Linnaea couldn't identify the source. Then a more familiar sound, someone knocking on the door. "Linnaea, it's Maya. Can I come in?" "Sure," Linnaea shouted back, scrambling off the bed. Maya had ordered her to rest, but after 3 days of pottering around the kitchen or lying on the bed, watching the wall screen, Linnaea felt more than a little lazy. She'd never have been allowed to do this back at Star Farm. The door whooshed open and Maya breezed in, wheeling a hospital trolley. "How are you feeling?" "I figured it was time for a house call." "Bored. Wondering if I should reconsider my life. The colony's a lot bigger than I'd realized." Linnaea waved at the screen, which showed some aerial footage of an arena that looked like a brand new coliseum, with a bunch of gladiators fighting a dragon on the sand, to the cheers of an immense crowd. "Are there really dragons here?" Maya glanced at the screen. "In the arena?" "So I hear, not that I've seen one myself." "I mean, you couldn't allow a monster like that to wander around the city. It'd be Godzilla all over again. Worse, it might damage the domes. Never mind the gladiators. I'd sign up to trank the thing myself if it threatened my home. Linnaea didn't doubt it. Any dragon who disobeyed Maya deserved whatever it got. Yet here she was, considering doing just that. But I miss the farm. Well, maybe not the farm, but the people. I'm not used to living alone. I've lived most of my life in foster homes and then training to go to space, before the dorms at Star Farm, and I'm not used to doing nothing either. I know I can't be a farm laborer anymore, but I need to do something or I'll go mad. Maya slid into one of the seats and steepled her hands on the circular tabletop. So what are you good at? Aside from farming and incubating babies, of course. Early childhood education, Linnaea blurted out. I just finished my Certificate 3 when I applied for the Farm Stars program. With the emphasis on breeding to make a sustainable colony, I knew I'd be responsible for my own kids, but that there'd be a need for childcare as well, especially qualified carers who could help the kids grow up to be capable, well-adjusted colonists, without the kind of trauma I grew up with in the foster system. It's the only thing I've ever really wanted to do. She ducked her head. Most people laughed when she said her goal in life was to be a stay-at-home mum, taking care of other people's kids alongside her own. But Maya didn't laugh. Really, she purred. Because I happen to know there's a vacancy on the night shift at the hospital creche right now, and seeing as I'm their most regular customer at the moment, I have a vested interest in seeing the position filled. Especially with someone who has both the passion and the qualifications to do the job well. Really? Linnaea's voice came out as almost a squeal. She cleared her throat and tried again. Because my original plan before I was accepted into the Farm Stars program was to work in a childcare center as I finished my studies, all the way up to a university degree, so I could teach in schools. I couldn't find a university here in the colony, though. Maya grimaced. It's on the cards, but all we have so far are technical colleges, traineeships and apprenticeships in the Alton system. One of your farm girls has applied to be a trainee midwife, actually. Once she's done with the initial theory components, she'll be shadowing me on my rounds. Perhaps you know her? Dandelion, I think her name is. Danny. Oh, I bet she'll be great at it, Linnaea said. Danny had grown up in the system too, though they'd never crossed paths until they'd joined Farm Stars. Funny how being an orphan made you want to make things better for children, right from the beginning. So you won't mind if she comes along on some of my house calls? Or maybe even the birth? Maya asked. Linnaea shook her head. No, it'd be wonderful to have someone I know there. It's settled then. Next time I'll bring her. But today I need to check you're fully recovered and fit for light work before I head back to the hospital to pull a few strings to land you the night shift job. I've racked up so many favors, it's about time I cashed some in. She winked. Which meant Linnaea would owe Maya even more for this. I don't know how I'll ever repay you, she whispered. Well, that's easy. All you'll have to do is do your job. Take care of the kids in the creche on night shift, and help my son grow into a capable, well-adjusted colonist, no matter what his genetic background is. Linnaea opened her mouth to protest that she'd do that anyway, only to have Maya shove a thermometer under her tongue and tell her to hold it there. What else could Linnaea do but obey? All was quiet in the cardiac ward. Tariq's only patient, Pollux, was in an induced coma, awaiting his heart transplant. If Tariq had still been capable of sleep, he would have crept into the break room and taken a nap, like he'd done on countless long shifts on Tito. On the Titanic, he'd have spent that time in the library or on the online medical databases, learning as much as he could. Here in the colony, he'd already exhausted the human additions to the library and databases, and there hadn't been any large-scale emergencies since the discovery of the wrecked ship, Magellan, so he couldn't even make himself useful elsewhere in the hospital. Not that he was much use to anyone except Pollux, and once that transplant was successful, Tariq wasn't sure what to do with himself. Maybe he should consider training in a different specialization, where there was greater need. Except, he'd never worked in a quieter hospital than this one. People in the colony enjoyed such a high standard of health, they barely needed the hospital, except in an emergency. Now, what he'd really like was for a patient to present with such unusual symptoms, or a rare diagnosis, that he could write up an entire case study on them to add to the database. Most of the new case studies from New Hope Hospital were on the patients who'd been trapped in damaged escape pods after fleeing the Magellan, in the field of stasis medicine, something he'd known very little about. He knew more now after reading them all, but what he'd give for a heart-related conundrum he could apply himself to. Maya's son, Christos. He still needed a scan. Tariq checked the rosters. Yes, Maya was working tonight, which meant the boy would be in the creche, probably asleep like almost everyone else in the colony at this time of night. He pressed the button for the elevator, which appeared to be stuck on the ground floor. Swaying under his breath, Tariq glanced around to make sure no one was watching, before he sank through the floor, slipping down to the ground floor, where he found one of the orderlies had managed to wedge a cleaning cart into the tracks for the elevator doors, so they couldn't close. A loud argument ensued between him, a nurse and a security guard, but Tariq didn't stop. He took a shortcut through the sterilization department, now dark and silent, instead of its usual clanking bustle of organized chaos. Only to discover that when he tried to palm open the door to the creche, his hand went right through the scanner. Tariq swore again, but he had a solution for this too. If the door wouldn't open to his ghostly handprint, then he'd walk through the door as though it wasn't there, and all the walls between him and the child if he had to. Luckily, Maya's boy was the only child in the nursery, and he was fast asleep. He didn't even stir as Tariq scooped him out of his cot, blankets and all, and carried him upstairs. If he'd seen any of the staff, he'd have told them who he was and where he was taking the boy, but there was no one to be seen, so he told himself he'd only be a moment. No one would even notice the boy was gone. By the end of her first afternoon there, Linnaea was ready to rethink working in the hospital creche. The kids were fine. Well-behaved even, though most of them were too young to even understand what good behavior was. The facilities were brand new, with more toys than Linnaea had owned in her lifetime. But she had to conclude that either childcare had taken giant leaps forward while she was in stasis, or the stasis process had melted entire sections of her brain, because she couldn't seem to get anything right. No. You do not let babies feed themselves. Makes a terrible mess. You must feed them and make them eat it all. After the second child had vomited creamed spinach all over her, Linnaea was pretty sure it would have been less messy to let the kids feed themselves. All children have nap at the same time. No exceptions. Except that while the newborns might need a nap every few hours, the toddler definitely didn't, and Linnaea wasn't sure what was worse. The constant crying of the newborns as they kept being jolted awake by the definitely not sleeping toddler, or the banging as the kid played an impromptu game of soccer in and around the cots, bouncing the rock he was using as a ball off any surface he could find. It didn't even matter if you took the rock off him, he'd kick around another one the moment the door was closed. Linnaea had searched the room twice and she knew there weren't any rocks in there that she could find. It was almost like the kid was pulling them out of thin air. But Ahiru, the only other employee at the creche, seemed to be the manager, cook, and overall dragon, if Linnaea hadn't seen her flat, webbed feet sticking out the bottom of her uniform. If she had to guess, she'd think the woman was some sort of alien duck creature. If there had been a university or community college where she could study to improve her skills, Linnaea would sign up for the course in a heartbeat. But as this was her only option. Linny. Linnea bit back a curse. Ahiru couldn't even remember her name. I'm coming. Where's Christos? Ahiru demanded. It is supper time. He should be in the playroom, ready for his meal. It's just a bottle of expressed milk, and he's the last kid left. He hasn't slept well today, so I figured I'd let him sleep himself out and then warm up his milk when he wants it, Linnea said. Sure, regimented routines helped when you had a dozen babies and not enough staff, but when the carer-to-baby ratio was 1-to-1, it made more sense to let the child's own biorhythms guide them. Besides, his mother wouldn't come to collect him for hours yet, and Linnea knew busy working mums liked to have a well-rested child they could spend quality time with after work, instead of a cranky one. You will wake him and feed him now so I can sign off on it and go home. Ahiru thundered. Linnea sighed. Fine. She could always put him back to sleep when he was full if he was tired. She took a step toward the nursery. No, first you must warm the milk, then wake and change the baby. Linnea turned on her heel and made for the kitchen instead. When the bottle was almost warm, she headed for the nursery, only to find an incandescent Ahiru had gotten there first. Where is he? The duckwoman shrieked. Linnea peered into the cot, where both the baby and the blankets she'd wrapped him in were nowhere to be seen. He was right here. The kid was only 3 months old. He couldn't even roll over yet, let alone climb out of the cot on his own. Unless the kid had some magical ability that allowed him to teleport. You are not allowed to let the children leave without an authorized adult signing them out. You are completely irresponsible, unfit to care for children, and I will not have you in my creche. The duckwoman tossed her head and stormed out, her large feet slapping on the plascrete floors with every angry step. Stay right here. I am going to report you to security for allowing a child to be kidnapped. Linnea sagged. If she truly had lost a kid, she deserved to be sacked. But she'd never had any problems back on Earth. She checked the tablet by the creche door, which was the only way in or out of the place. Sure enough, no one had signed Christos out. The scanner recorded the palm print of everyone who entered, and the last person to come in had been the little soccer star's dad, a craggy troll who'd barely fitted through the door. Christos had still been fast asleep when she'd gone to release Troll Jr. The only way Christos could have left was if someone had carried him out. But how did they get in? All she could think of was if Ahiru had opened the door for them, and now she was trying to pin the kid's kidnapping on Linnea. Well, Linnea wasn't having any of it. She was not a kidnapper or one's accomplice, and she was good at taking care of kids. She had to be, with 3 of her own on the way. Back on Earth, the first thing you did when there was an incident was notify the parent, not security, as the most likely explanation was that the busy parent had simply forgotten to sign the register. Or palm the register, as was the case here. Christos was probably safe at home with his parents, and one simple call could prove it. She pulled up the records for Christos, took a deep breath and called the emergency number. Hello. Hi, my name is Linnea from the New Hope Hospital creche. Oh God, don't tell me he's running a fever again. That would explain why he's been so cranky, but I can't come and pick him up right now. I have 2 births on the way in, and a third that I'm hoping with all my might only has Braxton Hicks contractions. She cleared her throat. Sorry, you don't need to hear my whining. Look, just give him some children's paracetamol, and put him in the isolation nursery until morning. As long as his fever cools down and he doesn't get worse, he should be fine. Or you could call his dad. Linnea swallowed. I'm sorry ma'am, but he's not running a fever. We can't find him. He's disappeared from his cot. He's what? Colorful swearing ensued, before the mother cleared her throat again. Look, Ahiru. My name is Linnaea, not Ahiru. Wait, Linnaea. Is it really you? It's Maya. Linnaea's heart constricted in her chest. Not only had she lost a kid, but the baby belonged to the midwife, who was her only friend in Metropolis City. She was doomed. She had to find the kid. I'm so sorry, Maya, I don't know what happened. He was in his cot, I swear. It was just me and Ahiru here, and we were in the playroom while he was sleeping. So Ahiru could shout at her some more without waking the baby. I thought you must have taken him, and forgotten to sign him out or something. But if you don't have him... Linnaea swallowed. She'd search every nook and cranny in the colony until she found him. I think I know where he might be. Give me a moment to make a call, will you? If we still can't find him, I'll call my husband. His specialty is search and rescue. If my son really is missing, he'll find him, and I'll make the kidnapper regret ever being born. Linnaea didn't doubt it. A shiver ran up her spine at the thought of what Maya would do to her if the missing child really was her fault. She blew out a breath. It didn't matter. Whatever fate Maya had in store, she'd deserve it for putting a child in danger. Maya's son slept like the baby he was, as Tariq couldn't help but be mesmerized at the 3D image of the boy's circulatory system, projected above the examination table in real time. Remarkable, he breathed, still staring. Both hearts pumped blood through the body, but they worked in turns, the beats so well synchronized you'd never know there were two hearts, or even anything different, unless you'd spent more than a century detecting the tiniest arrhythmia. The boy's chest was slightly larger to accommodate them, but Tariq imagined that would just make him grow into a physically imposing man. The baby scrunched up his face and snuffled. He was waking up. Tariq should get him back to the creche, where they probably had milk and whatever else the boy might need, stuff he didn't have here. He bundled the boy back into his blankets, and swept him out to his office, just as his tablet chimed with an incoming call. Tariq grinned as he answered it. Maya. You won't believe who I have in my arms right now. I hope it's my son, because the poor girl down in the creche is worried sick that someone had kidnapped him. I did tell you that they need you to sign him in and out, didn't I? Tariq nodded. Yes, you did, but I just faded, like all poltergeists did with time when they no longer had a purpose here. But he didn't want to burden Maya, or anyone else, with his own mortality. At least he'd lived long enough to meet this unique child. Hopefully, he'd have time to write up a case study on Christos too. Maya sighed, as if reading his mind. Yes, I know. Please take him back to the creche and apologize to the girl on night shift. She's a friend of mine and it's her first day, and she did not need the panic of a lost child on top of that. Right now, Tariq. If he'd had a spine, it would have straightened at her tone. She might only be a midwife, but she had the command presence to rival the most senior hospital consultant. Not to mention she was one of the few people who knew and used his real name. Yes, ma'am. Linnaea slumped in her chair, eyeing the bottom of her empty cup, as she tried to make up her mind whether to brew another coffee or to just give up and go home. Ahiru had pretty much fired her, so it wasn't like she needed to stay, but Ahiru hadn't returned either. She'd been angry enough when she left, so if she returned with security and Linnaea wasn't there, surely that would be worse than just sitting here a little longer, to face the music sooner. Also, Maya hadn't called back, which was more worrying, because Linnaea didn't know what that meant. She half expected Maya's husband, who she envisioned had to look like Mr. Universe, the hugest, hottest, most muscly hero her imagination could conjure up, the sort of wild fantasy she wanted, but would never have, would come bursting in here, shouting at her before going out again to save the day and his son. Because Mr. Universe was so perfect, so heroic, that of course he'd marry a woman carrying another man's child, and love that child as his own. And be the best, most perfect father a kid could ever want. Not to mention a perfect husband in every way, too. Which was why he couldn't possibly exist, and even if he did, he'd be married to someone amazing like Maya. Not some idiot who'd lost their child. Wherever Christos was, he'd probably woken up by now, hungry and with a wet nappy that needed changing. Linnaea was willing to bet he'd be wailing at the top of his lungs soon, if he wasn't already. She almost imagined she could hear him. Faintly, of course, because he must be far away, but somehow she was on her feet, heading for the front door. Only to find the door hissing shut, and footsteps sounding in the corridor to the nursery. That was definitely a baby's cry. Linnaea didn't hesitate. She marched briskly after whoever it was, intending to give them a piece of her mind. She might not be as brave as Maya, throwing people out airlocks, and it wasn't like they even had an airlock anywhere near here, but she found him leaning over Christos's cot, telling the baby, "We'd better get a fresh nappy on you first and then see if there's any milk for you," as he actually changed the boy's bum. This had to be Maya's hero husband. Who else could he be? She must have made some sound that gave her away, because he turned. As his eyes met hers, the universe stopped spinning. Mr. Universe. He was real. Hotter than a supernova, shoulders broad enough to sit on, with a face that could have been chiseled out of marble. He even glowed, or so Linnaea thought. It had to be her imagination. "It's you. You brought him back safe. Thank you so much." She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. She thought she must be imagining things when Mr. Universe kissed her back. Until she realized she wasn't imagining his arms wrapped around her, as huge and hard as they'd been in all her fantasies. Or the bulge between her thighs, for of course, she'd also wrapped her legs around him and climbed him like a tree, was bigger than any human man could possibly possess. And if she rubbed against him for just a little longer, her vision dissolved into stars and she would have cried out, if she wasn't so busy kissing him. Maya's husband. A man she had no right to touch, let alone kiss. Linnaea tore herself away from him, backing up until she was out of reach. Well, he was out of her reach anyway. Something she should have already known without the pregnancy hormones messing with her brain. What would Maya say if she knew Linnaea had kissed and dry-humped her husband? "I'm so sorry," he said. "Me too," Linnaea tried to say, but her dry mouth just wouldn't get the words out. "I forgot to sign him out. Maya told me when she put my name on the list of people who could collect him that I had to, but I forgot, and I thought we wouldn't be gone long enough for anyone to notice. Only I promised I'd do some routine tests on him, and the results were so unusual, I had to record some more detailed scans to be sure, and then I lost track of time. Maya called me when you noticed he was missing, but I'd left my tablet in my office, so I didn't hear it. She must have left a dozen messages before she finally got through to me. I came down here as soon as I could. I think he's hungry." Mr. Universe peered into the cot, and Christos blinked back up at him for a moment before he scrunched his face up in the precursor to a mighty "I want milk" wail. "How can I make it up to you?" By not telling Maya about the kiss and her other bad behavior, Linnaea wanted to say, but she didn't dare. Mr. Universe was so perfect, of course he'd tell his wife everything, and their marriage was so strong, she'd understand perfectly, and all the blame would be rightfully laid at Linnaea's feet. Of all the sins she'd committed tonight, if Linnaea had to choose, she'd rather admit to trying to seduce another woman's husband than losing their child. At least Christos was safe. His comm chimed and he swore. "I have to go. I'll come back tomorrow night." Christos chose just that moment to let rip with the mother of all cries, so Linnaea leaned down to scoop him up. But when she straightened, Mr. Universe had vanished. She jiggled the baby. "Let's go get you some milk then. You're a lucky man to have a daddy like that." If only her own kids would be as lucky. Well, they might not have the perfect dad, but they did have her, and she'd do everything she could for them. And in the meantime, she'd practice on Christos. Because, after almost losing him, she had a lot to make up for. Dr. Dark to Ed. Paging Dr. Dark to Ed. The halls rang with the urgent call that he hadn't heard until he stepped out of the creche. He let his feet carry him to the emergency department of their own volition, not thinking about his destination at all. No, his mind was full of that dark-haired nymph he'd kissed in the creche. A woman who'd kissed him, wrapped her arms and legs around him and made him feel almost alive again. Alive and horny no less, and he hadn't even thought that was possible. Without a heart or blood so speak of, a hard-on should have been impossible, yet he'd risen in salute to her irresistible enthusiasm. Stars, he'd wanted to back her up against the wall and pound into her until she screamed for joy. When he should have been apologizing for kidnapping her charge, and sending her and Maya into a panic. Tomorrow, he promised himself. He'd apologize properly, maybe even bring her a gift, and then? No, he was not going to ravish the girl he'd just met. No matter how much he wanted to. Unlike the night Falcon had been admitted, now the Ed was an absolute hive of activity, all centered around one bed. A girl, not much older than the one in the creche, lay on the bed, being straddled by someone in scrubs performing CPR, while a nurse pumped air into her lungs with a resuscitator. Dr. Dark. Thank the stars. Suspected electrocution from one of the armored suits in the arena. Defibrillator not working, so we've been doing manual compressions, but? Tariq nodded. Unlike Falcon, this girl was still alive, though she might not remain so for long if they didn't get her heart pumping again. Get me an examination bed. He deliberately forced his hand to fade, then slipped it into her side, feeling for her heart and the damage he knew he'd find. Just like Falcon, only this girl had a chance to survive. If they could get her heart started. Get me a crash cart. We'll start with a low voltage. The heart's taken enough damage, he said. He could feel it in his fingers. Not the flesh, but the electrical charge, nowhere near as strong as it should be in a healthy heart, pumping blood on its own. He'd need to hold this heart together, while the defibrillator did its work. Right, everyone clear. Except you. He pointed at the nurse, whose hands were clenched around the crash cart. You hit her with the paddles. The nurse looked horrified. But you have to stand clear too, doctor. Tariq just shook his head. I'm already dead. But she isn't, and she won't be if you save her life. Hit her now. It took 3 successive shocks before the girl's heart began beating again, and Tariq took a moment to further assess the damage. The injuries looked a lot like Falcon's, only without the additional stress of going without treatment for so long. Unlike Falcon, Tariq was almost certain a transplant could save her. And he already had the stem cells ready and waiting upstairs. Let's get her on an examination bed so we can better assess the damage, Tariq said. Her heart might not be the only organ in need of replacement. And someone get me a WCD, will you? We need to keep this heartbeat steady, or she'll go into arrest again. Does anyone have a name for her? Or next of kin? Phoebe. Human technician at the arena. The name listed here is Achilles, the arena manager. Tariq nodded. Likely her boss, if she'd been injured in a workplace accident. He needed to know her condition, and he'd also be able to notify her next of kin, if she had any here in the colony. The scans only showed what he already knew, that the current flowing through her body from the electrical discharge had damaged her heart, and she was lucky none of her other organs seemed to be damaged. The quick thinking of whoever had started CPR had probably saved her life. Right, let's get her to ICU. I want monitoring round the clock for the first 24 hours, then we'll reassess. Any deterioration in her condition, and I do mean any, you call me immediately, okay? Heads nodded. Tariq marched up to the region ward, to tell the staff to prep for a new heart for Phoebe. Now he had 2 heart transplants to perform, before he was no longer of use to the hospital. His family would have to wait a little longer before he was reunited with them. Not for the first time, he wondered what the afterlife held. Whatever it was, as long as he could see Rhoda and Gulmira again, he'd be happy. When Linnaea managed to drag her exhausted body back to Maya's apartment, she found a message from Flora, telling her how to access her first settler bonus, whatever that was, and her share of Star Farm's consulting fees for the first year. When she managed to follow what were probably simple instructions for someone who hadn't stayed awake most of the night, Linnaea discovered a bank account with what appeared to be a healthy credit balance. Something she'd need if she'd actually been fired from her job after a single day. She slept for most of the morning, before putting on one of the coveralls that everyone in the city seemed to wear, and venturing out into Metropolis City to explore. Linnaea wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Sure, she'd seen the spires and wide boulevards and fountains from the window of Maya's apartment, but it was different to walk among them and actually see the people who lived here. For a city, it wasn't anywhere near as crowded as she'd expected, and all the people she saw looked pretty much normal. Well, there were some with strange colored skin or fur, and she'd spotted some pointy ears and horns and maybe even someone with wings, but no one appeared truly alien. Maybe staying at Star Farm with her kids wasn't the best idea. They'd grow up and likely spend their lives in the colony, so the sooner they got used to being around aliens, the better. Metropolis City seemed to be where most of the shops were, which was a big point in its favor as a place to live. In one particularly spacious square, there were signs advertising a farmer's market on the weekend. After all the poor harvests they'd had at Star Farm, the pictures of fresh bread, strawberries and, were those really bananas? Oh, it was enough to make her drool. It was probably a good thing it wasn't the weekend yet, or she'd have spent more credits than she should have. Then she turned a corner and was hit with the smell of fish from Yep, Fish Supply, a shop that sold fresh fish. To her surprise, the prices were comparable to what she might have paid on Earth. Sure, the currency was credits and not dollars, but the numbers gave her hope that her bank balance might actually be enough to support her until she qualified for paid maternity leave. She'd learned from Maya that the colony provided accommodation, ration bars, healthcare and other essentials like the coveralls most people chose to wear, but extras like fresh food or less utilitarian clothing came at a cost. And some things were costlier than others. While she could afford to buy fish, the prices in the various restaurants seemed a bit steep. No matter. As a foster kid, she'd rarely dined out, so it was hardly a hardship to learn that she wouldn't be doing it much in the colony either. Home-cooked food was better for her, as well as her children. But if there was one thing she missed most from Earth, it was chocolate, and the delectable scent that wafted all the way across the square and into her quivering nostrils made Linnaea give the chocolatery her full attention. Until she saw the prices. For the cost of one small chocolate bar, she could eat lobster for a week, for lunch and dinner. The woman behind the counter registered Linnaea's shock, and said, "Everyone needs a little luxury in their life, and chocolate is so much better for you than alcohol. Everything here in the shop is handmade with only natural ingredients. In fact, our business charter with the colony means we have control over the entire supply of cacao beans, and we will have exclusive access to every harvest until the colony's 10th year, or the yield surpasses our capacity to process it, whichever comes first." She dropped her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Most of our customers are men, seeking to impress the lady in their life. Because you can't put a price on love, but artisan-made chocolate comes close." She winked. Without a job or a sugar daddy in her life, Linnaea knew she had to refuse. Besides, no matter how much she wanted the chocolate, there was still a chance morning sickness would prove more powerful than her anti-nausea medication, and the chocolate would be wasted anyway. Linnaea managed a weak smile. "If there's ever a man in my life, I'll let him know I like chocolate," she promised, before making a hasty exit. Maybe she should see if there were any chocolate-flavored ration bars left at Star Farm, or elsewhere in the colony, because she doubted she'd get any actual chocolate for, what had the woman said? For the next decade, at least. Linnaea kept walking, wanting to put as much distance between her purse and temptation as possible, until a bright splash of color in another shop window caught her eye. For a moment, she thought she was looking through a window into the jungle with impossibly green leaves and jewel-bright flowers. Until she got closer and saw that some of the colors weren't flora but fauna. Brightly colored parrots peeped between the leaves and blossoms, each one so perfectly captured on the cloth that it was easy to believe they might fly out of the shop window at any moment. The window beside it was covered in a scarf patterned with a tropical aquarium, and that was lovely too, but it was the birds that kept drawing her eyes back. It reminded her of the one school excursion she'd been allowed to attend. They'd gone to a wildlife park that had walk-in aviaries, where you were allowed to feed the tame birds. Most of the other kids had freaked out as the savvy birds had dive-bombed them to be the first to get to the food, but Linnaea had waited until the other kids had left, then sat down on one of the benches and waited. Before long the birds had surrounded her too, but on her terms. They perched on her arms and her shoulders, her knees and the seat itself, with one particularly bold sun conure making a right mess of her ponytail, but it was one of the happiest school memories she had. Never mind that her foster parents had shouted at her for ages about the bird droppings all over her clothes, when she'd gotten home. The day had been worth it. And this scarf looked like all those birds hiding, lying in wait, until they could emerge and grant her, or maybe her kids, another perfect day. Linnaea's feet carried her into the shop, before her mind could fully catch up. "How much for the bird scarf?" she demanded. Even if it cost as much as that chocolate bar, she had to have it, because, unlike the chocolate bar, she'd wear it to death. The woman at the counter smiled. "Parrot's Paradise on synth silk. That one's 20 credits. But it looks much better on a dress." She tapped her tablet, then pointed at something behind Linnaea. "See?" Linnaea turned, just in time to see the naked mannequin behind her magically appear gowned in a tropical jungle that clung to every curve. Linnaea swallowed. It looked lovely, but... "Do you do maternity clothes?" Linnaea forced herself to say. When the woman said no, she'd buy the scarf, like she'd originally intended, and that would be fine. The woman's face lit up. "Ooh, congratulations. Yes, we can put any pattern on any design you want. For maternity wear, I'd recommend the wrap dress." She tapped her tablet again, and the mannequin's outfit shimmered and flowed downward. "I can do it in synth silk if you want it for a special occasion, but the best part about the wrap dress is that it will fit you now all the way up to 9 months, and it's especially good for breastfeeding after the birth too. So if you'd basically like to wear it, wash it and then wear it again, you'll want it in the stretch poly. Synth silk will need careful washing and ironing after, and it has absolutely no give, while poly you can literally just throw on, and toss in the washing machine with everything else." She eyed Linnaea's midsection, though her belly was hardly even showing beneath the roomy coverall. "And once Junior's born, I'm sure there'll be a lot of everything else." Linnaea swallowed. "What other patterns does it come in?" In the end she bought 2 dresses, one in Parrot's Paradise and a second in Fading Dream, which at first appeared pale gray, but was actually a rainbow of colors, depending on how the light hit it. Plus the scarf, and it still didn't cost as much as that one chocolate bar. Of course, just thinking about chocolate reminded her that she hadn't eaten all day. She'd better get something before she went to work, because while getting fired would be bad, doing it on an empty stomach would be worse. Just the thought of it made her ill, so she bypassed the restaurants and headed for home. Only to take a wrong turn and end up staring hungrily at the window of the Bear Claw Bakery. She didn't think she could keep down a full meal, but she was willing to take a chance on one of those croissants. The door hissed open in invitation, and Linnaea stepped inside, inhaling deeply. Plenty of smells set off her morning sickness, but the sweet aroma of baked goods evidently wasn't one of them. "Can I help you?" chirped a familiar female voice. Linnaea blinked. "Franny." Franny's eyes widened. "Oh my God, Linnaea. Is that you? Flora said you were in hospital. Are you okay?" Linnaea managed a watery smile. "Sort of. I'm having triplets, and have to stay close to the hospital for regular checkups, but they discharged me a few days ago. I'm staying here in the city with one of the nurses. Today's my first day allowed out of the apartment, so I thought I'd do a little shopping. Only I forgot to have breakfast, so when I saw what was in the window..." Franny slipped out from behind the counter, crossed the room and flipped the sign on the door from open to closed. "We were due to close in about 15 minutes anyway, and it's not like we have much left to sell. Just a couple of croissants and a strawberry tart, with a cracked shell. Claw made that one, not me." "Of course." Linnaea's gaze darted from the croissants to the strawberry tart, that looked just fine to her. Even if it was cracked, it would probably taste the same. "How much are they?" "For you. You can have them all for free if you come and eat them in the kitchen while I work, and catch me up on everything I've missed since I left the farm. I need to mix up the dough for tomorrow, then set it to rise, and seeing as Claw is off doing secret squirrel lawyerly stuff for the colony administration, I'll be doing all the prep on my own." She plated up 2 massive croissants and the tart, then carried it through the door behind the counter. "Are you coming?" "Absolutely." An hour later, most of which Linnaea spent with her mouth full, nodding as Franny talked about running the bakery, and living in Metropolis City, with her hot bear shifter, who apparently made up for his mediocre baking skills by being absolutely stellar in the bedroom, Linnaea reluctantly left the bakery, promising to return. Probably after visiting the farmer's market, which Franny insisted was well worth it. On her way home, she mused that living in Metropolis City might not be a bad thing, though Franny had told her that the colony administration preferred to allocate city apartments to colonists who owned businesses in the city, or at least worked there. While she worked in the creche, if she still had a job after last night, that wouldn't be a problem, but after the babies were born, was the city the best place for them? As she headed back into the creche, Linnaea was certain of one thing: she didn't want a hero, or anyone else she didn't trust looking after her kids. Which meant she'd be their sole carer until they started school. One hella responsibility, but she'd give it her best. Her kids deserved no less. "You are lucky I give second chances. Screw up again and I will make security throw you out on your ear," Ahiru greeted her the moment she stepped through the door. "I have left you all of today's dishes and laundry to do while you are on night shift, as you only have one child tonight, and nothing else to do but sleep." She slung her bag over her shoulder and flounced out the door. Linnaea blew out a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. Evidently she wasn't fired then, though by the time she was done dealing with the soiled laundry, she might have wished she had been. "Good morning, Phoebe. How are you feeling today?" Tariq asked, flicking through the nurse's observations. "Alive, which I wasn't sure would be the case, given the last thing I remember was being stuck in that mech suit with lightning sparking all around me," Phoebe said. Did the night from the aircar disaster rescue me, too? Tariq looked puzzled. Who? Phoebe pointed at the patient across the room at Pollux. That guy. He saved those kids in the aircar crash a few months back. He doesn't look like he's in good shape. And if he looks that bad, you may as well tell me because I feel worse than he looks. Most patients needed to be eased into a possibly terminal diagnosis, but Phoebe just nodded and took it all in stride. Either that or she was in shock, and her processing would come later, after he left. He finished up his spiel with, "Your transplant heart is being grown as we speak, and if you rest and remain in bed until it's ready for transplant, you could enjoy a normal life with no reduction in lifespan. But if you don't take it easy, I won't be able to help you. What do you say? Can you do that for me?" She sighed. "I was saving up my holidays until I could take time off to lie on a beach somewhere, but I supposed lying here in bed, watching TV while someone brings me all my meals, I guess I can live with that." Tariq had seen a forced smile like hers 1,000 times, and he knew when he wasn't wanted. He'd return tomorrow to give the girl time. Meanwhile, he had another girl to apologize to. Twice. Once for making her panic about Christos, and the second time for running out on her. When he disappointed Rhoda, a gift usually helped. Of course, he'd known exactly what Rhoda liked, while the girl in the creche, he didn't even know her name. Back on Tito, he'd have asked one of his colleagues for advice, but the only people he knew well here were his patients and Maya, and no way did he want to look that clueless. If Falcon was still alive, he could have asked him. The bartender was always good for advice. But with Falcon gone, the only one of his patients he knew well enough was Pollux, and the boy was asleep. Actually, there was one other person he knew well, who might be willing to offer advice without thinking he was an idiot. Pollux's mother, Dulcinea. Yes. She was the perfect person to ask for help. Tariq finished scribbling down his patient notes, and headed out to the chocolatery. Linnaea sank onto a chair, utterly spent. The dishes were done, the last load of washing was in the dryer, and even Christos had finished his dinner and gone to sleep for the night. She knew there was a bed in the break room for the night shift carers to nap on, beside the baby monitor that linked to the nursery where Christos slept, but even though she was exhausted, her mind was too wired to sleep right now. After speaking to Franny, she'd flipped through the brochures for each of the satellite domes where she might live. The Ag and Eden domes were reserved for those who worked there, much like Metropolis City. The Aqua, Arena, Nix and Arbor domes were a mix of residential and business, and while they, too, gave preference to the people who worked in those particular environments, there were far more apartments than jobs in those domes, so she had more chance of being granted a suitable family home there. The Aqua Dome, as its name suggested, had a lot of water features, to cater for aquatic-dwelling titans and business ventures, like the fish farms. The Arena Dome boasted a desert-like dry heat, and the major sporting arena that hosted everything from fun runs to football matches, to epic dragon battles. Nix was the polar opposite to the Arena Dome, with its perpetual twilight and indoor ski slope with snow. All of them sounded like interesting places to visit with her children, particularly as they got older, but the potential risks each of them posed to babies and toddlers were more than she could comprehend. Water that they could drown in, deserts they could wander off and get burned or dehydrated in, and snow. She'd never seen the stuff herself, but she'd heard about frostbite and hypothermia, and all the things that could go wrong when skiing, so that left her with the Arbor Dome. The pictures of the Arbor Dome looked lovely. All trees and parkland and green, but the apartments were built to the same standards as the ones here in Metropolis City, so she'd have all that greenery for the kids to play in without having to actually maintain any of it. It sounded heavenly. She only hoped there was still some space there for her little family. When she had it, that was. She wondered where Maya lived. Hadn't she said she and her husband had a house in the Arbor Dome? Linnaea hadn't seen any houses in the brochure. Those were in the larger habitats, like the farms. Her husband hadn't looked like a farmer when he came by last night. She felt a flood of heat rush to her cheeks as she remembered kissing the man, and that orgasm. Now other parts of her were feeling hot, and that wasn't like her at all. Must be the pregnancy hormones, she decided, because she'd never even wanted to have sex before, while now her body seemed to crave it. With someone else's husband. God, what was wrong with her? A door hissed open in another room. "Hello, is there anyone here?" A male voice called. Linnaea swore softly. Speak of the devil, but in all honesty, she'd have preferred to summon the devil himself, and not Maya's hot, handsome husband. And there he was, in the gorgeous flesh, glowing just as he had last night. Linnaea couldn't help but breathe a little sigh of longing. Why couldn't there be a Mr. Universe out there for her, as well as Maya? "I'm so sorry about last night. Look, I even brought a little gift to help make up for all the trouble I caused, in the hope that you'll forgive me." He held out a box. Linnaea's breath caught in her throat. It was a box of chocolates, about the same size as the croissant she'd eaten in Franny's bakery. Unlike the croissant though, she knew exactly how much this box cost. "I can't accept that." "What would your wife say?" she hissed, thrusting her hands behind her back so she wouldn't give in to the terrible temptation to snatch the chocolates out of his hand. He ducked his head, looking embarrassed. "She'd probably tell me the box is too small, and to go back and get a bigger one, and grovel a whole lot more, before she'd forgive me, but in my defense, I never put her in a position where she might have even thought our daughter was missing. I don't think there's enough chocolate in the universe for that. At least the universe spared her that loss, in the end. The robots killed my whole family instantly in the same blast." Linnaea's mouth dropped open, and she couldn't seem to close it. Her mind whirled too fast for her to catch. Maya had a son, not a daughter, and she couldn't possibly be dead. There weren't any robots in the colony, they weren't allowed. Therefore, "You mean you aren't Maya's husband?" He snorted and shook his head. "I wish. Everyone who's met her wants to be married to Maya, but she made her own choices, and if there's any man who deserves her, it's Ghost. Me, I'm no ghost." "Well, sort of, but, look, the difference between us is that when he goes in to save his family, they survive and they all get to live happily ever after, whereas me, I'm just a surgeon. Not a hero." Horror crushed her heart. She'd blurted out the first thing that came to mind, when what she should have said was, "I'm so sorry for your loss." She followed the belated statement up with a hug. But just like last night, she didn't want to let go. And when she lifted her lips for a kiss, he gave it to her. Stars, kissing her was better than he remembered. His lips and tongue tingled every time they touched hers, and he knew she could feel it too. It hadn't been like this with Rhoda. Oh, he'd loved her and they'd been good together, but this was something else. This time, he felt everything. When she wrapped her arms and legs around him, he could feel how wet she was for him, and he couldn't deny how hard he was for her in return, not least of all because she could definitely feel it, rubbing against him the way she was. Which made him decide to give her something much, much better and more personal than a box of chocolates. He slid a hand into her pants, feeling her nerve endings zing with electricity as he found her clit. "Let me take care of you," he whispered between kisses as he stroked her to a climax. "Yes." He smothered her cries of joy with more kisses, before beginning again. The second time he had to hold her up at the end, as she seemed to become boneless in his arms as she gasped, "Oh, more, please." He'd never done this before, not as a ghost. He didn't even know if it was possible, but he wasn't going to refuse her. He only prayed that he wouldn't fade before she was satisfied. Her pants puddled on the floor as he freed his erection, positioning himself to enter her. "Yes," she said again, her eyes begging him. Tariq drove his cock home, and almost exploded on the spot. Stars, but she felt good, wrapped tightly around him as he plunged into her over and over again, until the impossible happened. He peaked in one blinding flash. No man had ever given her an orgasm before, and he'd already given her 3. When Linnaea begged him for more, she knew she was being greedy, but she didn't care. His fingers felt so good inside her, rubbing all the right places, leaving her all tingly wherever he touched. She half expected him to say 3 orgasms was plenty, and she'd have to agree, but when she saw him pull his cock out, for a moment, she froze, terrified that he'd hurt her like Falcon had on her first time. But even if he did, she owed him a bit of pleasure in return for all he'd given her. So she dropped her pants, swallowed and said yes, letting her eyes beg him to be gentle. Then his cock touched her clit, and it was like an instant electric shock, an orgasm powerful enough to steal her breath and her wits, and the next thing she knew, he'd entered her. Now she tingled everywhere inside, like his cock was a vibrator instead of flesh and blood, setting off every nerve until all she could do was moan in pleasure at the sheer avalanche of sensation set off by every single thrust. She could feel her next orgasm building, but she was afraid it was more than she could take. She almost asked him to stop, but he felt so good inside her, and she wanted him to enjoy this too, that she couldn't. She just couldn't. So as she crested what she knew would be the biggest, most incredible orgasm of her life, she sucked in a sobbing breath and prayed she didn't scream. Then her vision went white, as lightning seemed to arc out of him as he stilled, and she detonated. Holy fuck. She came to lying on the bed, with Mr. Universe hovering over her. "I'm sorry, we should have used protection. I never thought, I didn't think it was possible, and now, if you're pregnant." Linnaea couldn't help it. She burst out laughing. "You're too late. I'm already pregnant, to a dead guy called Falcon Hahn. And there's nothing to be sorry about. That was amazing. The best sex I've ever had." She laughed again. "God, I don't even know your name, and I'm pretty sure I'm in love with you." "Tariq," he blurted out, holding out his hand. "And you are amazing, because I didn't know sex that good was even possible." "Linnaea," she managed to say, shaking his hand. If she'd known sex could be this good, shit, she wanted heaps more of it. "Please, can we do that again?" He fisted his jutting cock, which was already hard and ready for action. He was Mr. Universe, all right. Her Mr. Universe, at least for tonight. "As many times as you want, Linnaea." It was only afterwards, when the orgasmic glow had faded and Tariq was back on the ward, checking his patients, that it hit him, Linnaea was Falcon's widow. He'd fucked Falcon's widow. He'd fucked her so hard and so well that he'd even given himself an orgasm, something ghosts weren't supposed to get. Even now he couldn't stop thinking about her. Couldn't stop feeling her. Didn't fade once all day, and even smacked into a wall instead of walking through it, like he normally would. So by the time evening came and he knew she'd started work, he couldn't stop himself from going down to the creche to see her. To peel her out of her scrubs and bury himself deep inside her, making her clench and moan and maybe even scream, before she begged him to do it all again. Until his own orgasm hit him like a lightning strike, again, and he could barely think. Falcon would forgive him, he told himself. Tariq would take care of Falcon's widow for as long as she needed, in any way she wanted, and then he'd fade. In the afterlife, before he reunited with his family, he'd find Falcon and explain. Oh, but he'd have to stay until the babies were born, so he could describe them to Falcon. Falcon would understand, surely. But the more time he spent with Linnaea, the more guilty he felt, because now he knew why Falcon had wanted so much to live. To settle down with Linnaea, giving and taking pleasure from her gorgeous body every night, and playing with his kids every day, bliss surely. The sort of future Tariq had hoped to have with Rhoda and Gulmira, and might still have in the afterlife. Rhoda would understand why he had to take care of Linnaea. If he'd died and Rhoda had lived, he'd have wanted her to have the love and support of a good man, if he couldn't be there for her. But Linnaea, stars, Linnaea. The way she spread her legs, wetness glistening just for him as she begged, "Tariq, please." What else could he do but to take the gift she offered, and give her everything in return? Linnaea fell into a routine, or maybe it was a rhythm. She worked nights in the creche, making sure the kids were asleep before Tariq appeared to fuck her senseless for half the night, before she collapsed into the bed. Then morning would come and she returned to Maya's apartment, where she slept some more before going out in the afternoon, mostly to see Franny or for regular checkups at the hospital, but occasionally shopping, seeing as her paycheck from the creche allowed her to afford a few luxuries. Not chocolate, though after she'd eaten the contents of the box Tariq had brought her, she understood why those were so expensive, but Franny's bakery occasionally did chocolate croissants or tarts, which satisfied her increasingly frequent chocolate cravings. Between the farmers' markets and the garden Flora had set up in her apartment, Linnaea now had fresh strawberries and spinach, plus a selection of other fruit and veggies that kept even Maya satisfied that she was eating properly. She'd gone back to the shop she'd bought the dresses from, and purchased a selection of synth silk underwear, which she shyly showed Tariq. He'd responded by spending half an hour worshipping her breasts with his mouth, until everything tingled before going down on her. She could have sworn sparks flew as he tongued her clit, but she was sure it was just her imagination. As her tummy swelled with the babies growing inside her, she kept expecting him to break it off, that one night he wouldn't come, but the first time one of the babies kicked him, he'd just dropped to his knees and covered her belly with kisses. That night, he'd made love to her more tenderly than before, slowing his pace so that he didn't wake the babies, which had driven her mad because her orgasm just kept building and building, so slow to reach her release, that when she did she almost screamed. Finally it was her last day at the creche. Maya had insisted she start her maternity leave, and Linnaea knew better than to disobey. But then Tariq arrived and she dropped to all fours on the bed, the only position in which they could comfortably make love. Now her tummy was so big, and she forgot all about everything except the sheer multitude of sensations provoked by the alien thrusting deep inside her, as pleasure overwhelmed her. When the door chimed to let Linnaea know she had a visitor, she had to call, "One sec, I'm coming," as she levered herself up off the couch. She felt like a beached whale, only she carried an ocean inside her. It had to be Maya, even if she wasn't supposed to be here for another hour or two. Everyone else worked during the day, even Tariq. Only when she reached the door, she saw two men she didn't know. "Yes?" she asked, looking from one to the other. One had horns and hooves sticking out of a pair of furry pants, and the other one looked like a normal human. Then again, Falcon had looked human too, but she'd known he was Titan. You didn't get the baby bonus from the colony with a full-blood human baby, just one that was half human, half Titan. For the first time, she wondered how that worked with 3 babies. Did she get 3 bonuses, or just one? "Are you Linnaea?" the human one asked. "No last name. Just Linnaea." The way she liked it. Forgetting all the names she'd been given by various foster families over the years, she was free to be herself. "Yes, that's me." The men exchanged a glance. Then the human one said, "Do you know a man named Falcon Hahn?" Linnaea narrowed her eyes. "Not that it's any of your business, but he was the father of my children. He's dead now though, so if you're looking for him, you're out of luck." She reached for the door controls, to palm it shut again. "No, wait please. I'm Hercules and this is Vertumnus. I'm the new owner of the one-shot cantina, the pub Falcon Hahn used to manage. We've been looking through his things, trying to find a next of kin, and we found his last will and testament, which names you and any children you might have as his heirs. He eyed her belly. Are there any other children? Linnaea laughed. No, thank the stars. 3 will be quite enough when these are born. Running around after other children while she was this huge would be impossible. Well, first my condolences on your loss, Mrs. Hahn, Vertumnus said. My name is Linnaea. I didn't marry the man. I'm just carrying his children, she bit out. Vertumnus looked flustered. Oh yes, sorry. I should have. Yes. I did know that. Is there somewhere we can sit down? Linnaea sighed and stepped out of the doorway. I guess you'd better come in. 2 hours later, when Maya arrived, Linnaea was still sitting at the table, reading through the copy of the will the 2 men had left, barely believing what it said. You didn't answer, so I let myself in, Maya said. Linnaea nodded. What's wrong? Linnaea waved at the papers spread out across the table. You know how I told you the father isn't in the picture anymore. Well, he's dead and he made me his heir. There's money, a whole heap of stuff he left behind, and a house he bought for us. A cabin with a big garden, set in the woods. It's not even finished yet, because the builders were waiting for him to get back to them on some of the color choices when he died. I have a house. I've never had a house before. Maya reached for the will. May I? Linnaea nodded. Be my guest. I'd think I was imagining things, except there were 2 men here earlier, who came to deliver the news. I don't even know if I want a house. I mean, sure, I want to live in the Arbor Dome, but I'm not much of a gardener. I'm just an ex-foster kid who spent the last year of her life farming, and is about to become a single mother of 3. She considered mentioning Tariq, but while the sex was all kinds of amazing, they'd never talked about the future, and she knew it was too much to ask for a man to take on not just her, but 3 kids by another man. So she just enjoyed every moment they had, knowing it would end the moment her babies were born. As it should be, she wouldn't have time for sex with 3 kids to take care of. No, best that Maya didn't know about Tariq. Even if Linnaea was definitely in love with him, there was no way Tariq could possibly share her feelings. No one had ever loved her when it was just her, and now, well, maybe her kids would. If she did things right. Which meant making all the right decisions, starting now. Linnaea buried her head in her hands. It's too much. This is a fancy house, and enough money to afford chocolate every week. You could sell the house and keep the money. There's nothing here that says you have to live in it. Colony administration will give you a lovely apartment in the Arbor Dome instead, if you don't want the garden. I admit the privacy and space of the Arbor cottages are what won me over, so I think you should see the place first. You might fall in love with it, the way I did with Ghost's house. Maya grinned. Actually, the alien who impregnated me also unintentionally left me with a salvaged ship. I may have kept a bunch of the cargo, but I sold the ship and everything left on it for quite a tidy sum. Besides, you don't have to decide what to do with the house now, do you? You can stay here as long as you need, and I'll help you with your housing application right after the birth. Linnaea had to laugh. I don't think I'll care about houses after I've given birth. I'll be too tired. You never know. I'm just saying I'll help is all. Maya rubbed her hands together. Right, are we good? You're a rich woman, and you deserve everything good that the universe has given you. Never doubt that. Now, are you ready for me to check on you and these babies? It's almost time to meet them. Linnaea took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. Yes, it was time the universe offered her something good, after all the shitty luck she'd had with foster homes. But was it wrong to wish it would give her Tariq, instead of wealth and a house? She wasn't ungrateful. It was nice to have money. But love would be better. No one had ever loved her before, except maybe the parents she couldn't remember. To be loved by Tariq would be the ultimate gift from the universe. A gift she didn't dare hope for. So she'd settle for 3 healthy children and an easy birth. Sure thing, ma'am. I'm yours to command. That's my favorite patient. Now lie back and let's see what these babies are up to. When Tariq turned up at the creche to find a grumpy duck shifter instead of Linnaea, who groused about Linnaea going on maternity leave as though it was a personal insult to the duck shifter, he knew he was in trouble. He told himself love was just a bunch of pheromones and chemistry, none of which worked on a ghost, so he couldn't possibly be in love with Falcon's widow, and what they had was just an extreme form of lust because she was so absolutely luscious, and irresistible and sweet and insatiable. But right now, after not seeing her for a week, he was walking through walls and passing through things instead of grabbing them, like he'd lost the will to live. And his whole body ached for her, which shouldn't be possible. Ghosts didn't feel pain except maybe the emotional variety, and even that he wasn't sure about, because that was all brain chemistry, too, which required an actual brain to work. Maybe he should have tried to study ghost physiology, instead of just focusing on corporeal beings. Then he'd have some answers for what was wrong with him. Now it was too late. He couldn't access any information when his tablet was more likely to fall out of his hands, and swiping or tapping the screen usually only ended up with his fingers going all the way through the device, without it registering his touch at all. In the absence of a better hypothesis, Tariq was forced to conclude that he was hopelessly, irrevocably in love with Falcon's widow, and if he didn't stay away from her, he was going to do something even more stupid and unforgivable than he already had. And if he did, there was no way he'd ever see Rhoda and Gulmira again, or even get the chance to tell Falcon about his kids. Dr. Dark to Operating Theatre 3. Dr. Dark to Operating Theatre 3. Tariq sped through the walls, all the way to theatre. If he was needed there, then there must be some sort of cardiac emergency. Anything to distract him from finding Linnaea's address and going to visit her. But Theatre 3 was empty, with the surgical team still in the change rooms, not even scrubbed up. Then he spotted a familiar face, and headed straight for her. She'd tell him what was going on. Maya. What's the emergency? Tariq. Thank you for coming. Look, we're hoping it's not an emergency, but we didn't want to take any risks, so I suggested asking for your help. Dr. Shepard will be performing the C-section, but I think I detected an irregularity in one of the baby's heartbeats, so I was hoping you'd be able to monitor the babies throughout the birth. The monitoring equipment is usually fine when it's just mum and one baby, but with 3 of them, it's having trouble separating out the babies, whereas with your talents and experience, we both know you're far superior to any machine. Even if you're not a pediatrician, after seeing you with Christos, I know you're the doctor I need for this birth. If he'd had a heart, it would have swelled in his chest with a combination of pride and gratitude. Maya wasn't the sort of colleague who asked for help, and if she wanted him here, Tariq couldn't possibly refuse. In fact, this was a situation where his tendency to fade would come in handy. His hands would be able to pass through flesh to diagnose any problems before it was too late. Of course. I'll wait in the operating theatre for you. One of the few benefits of being a ghost was that he didn't need to disinfect his hands or wear surgical scrubs like the rest of his team, because there weren't any corporeal parts of his body that could contaminate the patient, or carry microorganisms that might cause infection. The glow of his ungloved hands also helped shed light at angles the overhead lights couldn't reach, particularly in complex surgeries like a birth. He'd spent plenty of time in surgery over the years, but this was the first time since Gulmira's birth that he'd actually been present during a caesarean section. Maybe if he imagined the mother was Rhoda, he'd be able to focus on the present, instead of letting his mind wander to wherever Linnaea was, and what she might be doing. Yes. He was a professional. He could do this. Maya and a plump young orderly, Tariq didn't know, wheeled the bed into the operating theater, trailed by an anesthetist. The team fussed around with the surgical drapes, and Tariq stayed by the wall where he'd be out of the way. Right, introductions, Maya said briskly. Most of the team you already know, but in case you don't, this is my apprentice midwife, Dandelion, our best obstetrician, Dr. Shepherd, and here to monitor the babies during the birth, at my request, is our heart specialist, Dr. Dark. Tariq, meet Linnaea. I told her how well you take care of my son, which is why I know you'll take just as good care of her and her babies. If he'd been able to breathe, the air would have stuck in Tariq's throat about now. Even dressed in surgical scrubs and lying on the operating table, Linnaea was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. And the way his eyes lit up with joy at the sight of him, he sighed. He might not be able to refuse Maya, but he would do anything, absolutely anything, for Linnaea. He clasped her fingers in his, careful not to dislodge the cannula in her arm. Miss Linnaea, I'm honored to be allowed to be present during such a joyful event. I'll watch over your babies like they were my own. Her beaming smile lit up the room brighter than any of the lamps. Thank you for being here. I know everything will be okay now. He prayed she was correct. With Tariq holding one hand and Danny holding the other, Linnaea finally allowed herself to relax. She hadn't dared to ask anyone to accompany her while she gave birth, but if she could have, she'd have wanted Tariq, Danny and Maya. She'd been worried that Maya wouldn't be in charge, with Dr. Shepherd there, but Maya had assured her that Dr. Shepherd had not only taught her everything she knew, but she'd been trying to get Maya to accept the job as head of the department, which would make her Dr. Shepherd's boss. Besides, she was the doctor Maya would have wanted at her own birth, which was enough to convince Linnaea. But now she could fix her eyes on Tariq. She barely noticed the strange, barely there sensations on the other side of the surgical curtain. If he was here, then everything would be all right. Even if he was acting like a stranger meeting her for the first time, which she was pretty sure he had to do, as there were rules about doctors dating or sleeping with patients, though she'd never been his patient until today, and none of that mattered. He was here. And when she heard the first baby's cry, she thought her heart would burst. Until she saw her in Tariq's arms, and how tenderly he looked down at her, then it was Linnaea's turn to cry. But they were happy tears. Definitely happy tears. When Linnaea almost lifted her arms to take the baby from him, she heard Maya say, "You can hold them later, when the surgery is finished. There are still 2 more to go, you know." Linnaea nodded and subsided. Tariq was taking care of little Astra, just like he'd promised. Then Dara, before little Kestrel made his appearance. Linnaea had never seen babies so tiny. Maya came around the curtain, smiling. "Congratulations, Mum. You have 3 happy, healthy little babies, 2 girls and a boy. They're a little small, because they're early, so we'll probably have to keep you all in hospital for a week or 2. That'll give Tariq time to give them a more detailed scan too, so you can be sure anything unusual is caught early. Not that unusual means something's wrong. It's just, hybrid kids sometimes have hidden extras that will help them when their abilities manifest later. Or so I'm told, seeing as we still don't know what my son's genetic background is, while at least you know their dad is a kestrel shifter. Was a kestrel. Hence Falcon's insistence as a condition of inheritance, that his son be called Kestrel. Not what Linnaea would have picked for the boy, but it wasn't a bad name, and if it gave him more opportunities as a result of growing up in a more financially stable household, she was willing to compromise with a dead man. Besides, Kestrel could always change his name if he hated it. Maya dropped her voice to a whisper. You know, now the babies are born, you should really look into dating, like you said you would. There are a surprising number of hot, single alien guys in the colony, through no fault of their own, what with having to flee their planet, followed by the war and all. I mean, Tariq likes you, and that's the first time I've seen him interested in any woman, Titan or human. Linnaea felt her cheeks grown hot. Maya was just imagining things, or seeing more into Tariq's familiarity with her than was really there. Sure, they'd had lots and lots of amazing sex, but that wasn't the same as settling down together. Sex wasn't forever, though she wouldn't mind if it was. Especially the way he'd said he'd watch over her babies like they were his own. She sighed. More fuel for her fantasies when she was home, alone, with her babies. She should probably buy a vibrator, if anyone in the colony sold such a thing. A big one that glowed and tingled, and, who was she kidding? The best vibrator in the world wouldn't compare to Tariq. She looked around the operating theater, only to discover that both he and the babies were gone. Something brushed against Linnaea's breast, rousing her from a dream that left her strangely disoriented. "Who's there?" she mumbled, reaching for the remote that controlled the lights. Only to find that the remote wasn't there. "Careful. He doesn't seem to want to latch on today. I think he slept too long, so I know he's starving, but he doesn't seem to remember how to fix things. Unlike your girls. They know where milk comes from, all right." She relaxed at the sound of Tariq's voice. In his faint glow, she could see that her groper was actually her cranky son, stretched out on a pillow by her side on the big bed in Maya's apartment. An apartment where she lived alone with her babies. Linnaea frowned. "How did you get in here?" "Maya told me you were staying at her place." Which meant Maya had sent him here in a professional capacity, probably to check up on her babies. Not because he wanted to see her. That said, he was probably seeing a whole lot more of her than he wanted if he was helping her kids breastfeed while she slept. Very Sleeping Beauty, without all the dark lack of consent stuff. "She also said I should bring you this." He held up an insulated bag. "Ready-made meals to do you for the week, cooked by the chefs at Forge. She said if you tried to refuse, to tell you her sister-in-law works there, and she owed her a favor, and accepting food seemed a better idea than a carton of experimental alcohol, even if Nihal does brew some of the best wines and spirits in the colony. Plus, she owes you for taking over the night shift at the creche, because Christos's sleep schedule was as regular as clockwork when you took care of him, and now Ahiru's back on nights, he's all cranky again." He looked puzzled. "Is Ahiru the angry duck shifter woman?" Linnaea thought of the woman's webbed feet. "So that's what she is." Not that it mattered any more. She'd be too busy taking care of her own kids to have time for anyone else's. The last 2 days here at home had been exhausting. But she should probably put the food away before it went bad. She clutched Kestrel to her chest and tried to swing her legs off the bed. "What are you doing?" Tariq asked in alarm. "You're supposed to get as much bed rest as possible, and no lifting heavy loads." As if Kestrel's tiny body could be considered heavy. He was the lightest of the three of them. Almost as though he was reading her mind, he said, "I'll put the food away. Can I get you anything while I'm up?" Linnaea shook her head as she let herself and Kestrel down on the pillows again. This was strange. Aside from the nurses in hospital, no one had ever taken care of her like this. Ever. And, much though she wanted Tariq to stay, she knew he was a senior doctor with plenty of responsibilities, which didn't include bringing her. Was that a croissant and coffee in bed? Those couldn't have come from Forge. The croissant looked like Franny's work for sure. "The croissants and tarts were my contribution. I stopped by the bakery in town, and they told me they were your favorite." Linnaea felt tears prick at her eyes. This was too much. Tariq in her house, bringing her breakfast and helping her, and being every bit as lovely as she'd imagined he could be, even when they weren't having super hot alien sex. It had to be a dream. But even the coffee tasted divine, and the croissant. She couldn't stop the tears now. This can't be real. I know that, but I also don't want to wake up, she cried. Tariq's smile was achingly gentle. When my daughter was born, my wife was stuck in bed for weeks after her surgery. She was in labor for almost a day before they performed a C-section, and there were complications afterwards that sent her back to hospital again. Even as a junior doctor, I was at my wits' end, terrified I'd lose them. Maybe even then, somehow, I knew I would, though none of us saw the robot rebellion coming. He shrugged. I have a lot of leave owing, and I know you don't have anyone. If Falcon were here, he was a cousin on my mother's side, you know. She was a kestrel shifter too, though a Nankeen kestrel, not an American kestrel like him. My sisters inherited her wings, and they'd all go flying together while I stayed home with Dad. He was a heart shifter, the biggest stag you ever saw, while I guess I was the black sheep in the family. Half kestrel, half heart, but I could never shift fully. Linnaea's eyes widened. You're a shifter? She'd known he was a Titan, but she'd never expected that. Only sort of. Here, I'll show you. Before her eyes he blurred, before his form resolved into a horned man with furry legs and hooves, a little like Vertumnus. Only while Vertumnus's horns had been curled around his head, Tariq had a massive rack of antlers that nearly brushed the ceiling. And between those furry legs, Linnea felt her cheeks grow hot. Surely he'd been wearing pants a moment ago, but now she was staring at the most deliciously huge cock she'd ever seen. If only she hadn't given birth a couple of weeks ago. She wanted to jump into his lap and ride him all night. Why did he have to be so wonderful? He coughed, blurred, and he was back to his usual self. Sadly, with pants and a shirt. Anyway, Falcon was family, which makes you family too, so I took some time off, and I'm here for you. Thank you, she whispered as she burst into tears again. At least a dozen times a day, Tariq almost told Linnea he loved her, but he managed to bite his tongue just in time. Every time he mentioned Falcon, she started to cry, and he didn't want to make her miserable. He was there to help. Rhoda had been weakened by the birth and subsequent infection, so he'd taken care of his invalid wife and their newborn almost completely. Linnea was nothing like Rhoda. Every time he turned his back, it seemed she was out of bed, trying to do something she shouldn't, even if it was just collecting one of her kids from their cot for a feed. Stars, those kids could drink. Then again, if Linnea's luscious breasts were his only food source, he'd be a glutton too. But with 3 of them, each taking turns, she had little time for anything else but feeding them, so he could step in and do everything else. While she slept, he'd combed Forge and ordered more ready-made meals, covering the costs himself, instead of depending on Maya or her sister-in-law's generosity. The girl from the bakery, a friend of Linnea's from the farm, he discovered, was only too happy to deliver breakfast and coffee, as long as she got baby cuddles with whoever wasn't currently drinking their body weight in breast milk. The more time he spent with Linnea's little family, the less Tariq wanted to leave. He told himself it was just because he missed Rhoda and Gulmira, who he'd soon get to see again, not daring to let himself even think about the possibility of staying. Because Linnea wasn't Rhoda. She was healing, getting stronger every day, and from Maya's paeans of praise about how well she'd cared for Christos, Tariq knew Linnea would raise her kids as the absolute epitome of motherhood. No wonder Falcon had picked her. Tariq wished he'd met her before Falcon, but there was no point going there. He hadn't, and even if he had, a poltergeist couldn't give her children. No, everything in the universe happened for a reason, and Tariq had had happiness with Rhoda once. He didn't deserve to experience it again. So the weeks passed, and Linnaea needed him less and less, but Tariq was determined to stay as long as she'd let him. Just like the girl from the bakery, he enjoyed baby cuddles too. "Hey Tariq, I was wondering what you're doing on the weekend," Maya said. He stopped, opening his mouth to say he'd be at Linnaea's place, helping her as always before he closed it again. He knew Linnaea was fully healed from surgery, and cleared to do anything she wanted in the colony. She didn't need him anymore, so if Maya wanted him to come back to work, he should make himself useful where he was most needed. "Nothing," he said. She beamed. "Oh good. Because Ghost and I are having a barbecue at our house, and we wanted to invite you. And Linnaea. Could you let her know? It's sort of a secret, belated baby shower for her, now she's fully recovered, so I invited all the girls from Star Farm too. I figured it would be better to have something at our place, instead of her new apartment in the Arbor Dome. Do you know if she has the address yet?" Tariq shook his head. "I hadn't heard anything about her new apartment. Though an apartment was hardly the best place to bring up 3 kestrel shifters. If they were anything like his sisters, they'd need plenty of trees and space to fly around, with grass or vegetation for a soft landing while they were fledging. What they really needed was a cabin, like Maya and Ghost had. Hadn't Falcon talked about buying one for his family? That was something Tariq could do for Linnaea before he faded. He had plenty of credits in the bank, and nothing to spend them on. It wasn't like he could take them with him, either. Falcon and Rhoda would approve, he was sure of it. Tariq nodded. "I'll tell her." Then he hurried off, to speak to someone in the housing office, to see how he could acquire one of the houses in the Arbor Dome. Only to be told that the housing office didn't own any of those houses, which were built by a private construction company, and sold to wealthy colony residents, who could afford the luxury of a freestanding house in the woods, instead of an apartment. So he called the construction company's office next. "I'm afraid all the houses in the Arbor Dome have been sold, sir," came the response. "However, there is one that has not yet been occupied, as it's incomplete. The buyer died during construction, and there was some trouble identifying who it belonged to. It's on my list to contact the heir this week, actually. I could give them a call tomorrow and see if they're willing to sell." "That would be great, thanks," Tariq said, and gave the girl his details before asking for the address of the house. He could sneak away from Maya's barbecue, and take a look around, to see if it would be suitable for Linnaea before he bought it. The sooner he got this sorted, the better. Because if Linnaea no longer needed him, he'd fade away for sure. Which would be for the best, he told himself. If Linnaea wanted a partner in life, not that she needed one, then she deserved a hero like Maya's husband, someone who could protect her as well as give her anything she wanted. She didn't need a failure like him, who'd lost his first family so spectacularly, he didn't deserve another one. Especially not with an amazing woman like her. But she deserved everything he, and the universe could give her. So he hoped this house was good enough. Linnaea couldn't seem to stop crying. First, there was Maya's beautiful house, and her loving husband, which she had to admit she was madly jealous about. Or if not actually jealous, because she knew Maya deserved all the happiness in the universe, she wished she could have something like it too. Then there were all the people in Maya's beautiful garden, who'd all brought presents for her and her babies, which Linnaea simply couldn't comprehend. Maya insisted that was normal at a baby shower, but Linnaea didn't know most of them, yet every single one of them had brought something for Dara, Astra and Kestrel, and some were for her alone. Even Eva had brought her what she claimed was the best alien vibrator in the universe, with attachments to pleasure her in every possible place. Linnaea hadn't dared to open the box, but she'd fervently hoped it came with instructions, because she was more than ready for a little self-care, and with everything Tariq did for her, she didn't dare ask him for help. Besides, he dropped hints about going back to work soon, which meant she probably wouldn't see him again. It was time. The sex before the birth had been amazing, and his help these last few weeks had been wonderful, but everyone in her life always left, so it was time for her to stand on her own 2 feet, and take care of her family on her own. The thought of all that responsibility frightened her sometimes, but she couldn't let that stop her. Dara, Astra and Kestrel were her family, and she would do whatever it took to give them the best possible start in life. Which meant it was also time to decide where she wanted to live. The housing office had allocated her a lovely apartment, with a balcony overlooking a really pretty part of the forest in the Arbor Dome, but she still had Falcon's house to consider. The builder had called her to say they had a potential buyer for the place, but they wanted the house as soon as possible, so Linnaea had promised to take a look today and let them know by Monday. But now she was here at Maya's place, surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate her and give her gifts. She couldn't bring herself to leave. As if by magic, Maya herself appeared at her side. "You know, you don't have to leave to put them down for a nap. Christos's cot is more than big enough for all 3 of them, and there's no way he'll go down for a sleep while there are so many people here. Here, I'll help you collect them up if you like." Linnaea scanned the assembled crowd. Sure enough, both Kestrel and Astra were getting cranky, though Dara just seemed to be lapping up the attention with her placid smile as she was passed from one set of arms to another. "Actually, I'm supposed to go and check out one of the houses here that I'm thinking of moving into. If there's any chance I could slip away for a few minutes once they're asleep, I'd be very grateful," Linnaea ventured. Maya let out a squeal. "You mean we're going to be neighbors? Oh, in that case, let me grab Danny. We'll get everyone bedded down while you go house hunting. Then when you come back, you can tell me all about it." Maya, being Maya, wouldn't take no for an answer, so it wasn't long before Linnaea found herself trudging through the trees, searching for the house she knew had to be here somewhere, but, oh. Falcon's cabin was more of a farmhouse, with wraparound verandas on both stories. The front door opened into a massive open-plan living area, with a central kitchen that had cupboards and benchtops, but no appliances. A wide wooden staircase led up to the second level, which was all bedrooms and bathrooms, though the bathrooms were unfinished too. Linnaea peered down at the garden, if you could call it a garden. Actually, the house was nestled in the woods, with no real garden to speak of, because the woods just seemed to end where the veranda began. She could put up a low fence like Ghost and Maya had, though theirs was mostly to keep their strange green chickens from wandering off than anything else, but this was perfect. Or it would be, once the place was finished. She'd never dreamed of owning a home so lovely when she'd been a foster kid back on Earth. Even Maya's Metropolis City apartment was luxury, compared to some of the places she'd lived. Maybe, when her kids were a little older, she should see if she could take in some foster kids of her own. She'd have the space for them, after all, and she'd be a damn sight better foster mother than most of the parents she'd had over the years. Movement in the trees down below made her realize she'd been daydreaming up here for far too long. She should head back down, lock up, and return to Maya's house before the babies woke up. She'd send a message to the builder in the morning, asking what they needed in order to make the place habitable, and how soon she could move in. She'd need to source furniture, and Linnaea. She stopped dead on the stairs as Tariq stood in the kitchen, staring at her. "What are you doing here?" they both asked at the same time. Linnaea laughed. "Well, this is my house, so I would have thought that would be obvious." He frowned. "The builder said it hadn't been sold yet, and they'd hold it for me until Monday. I was hoping to buy it for you, but—" "Why in the world would you buy me a house?" she asked. Sure, the sex had been amazing, but his help over the last few weeks had been more than she'd expected of him afterward. He ducked his head. Because Falcon would have wanted it, and your family. I've just about had enough of fucking Falcon, even if he was your family, she snapped as she stormed down the stairs. I'm sorry. I know you don't want to talk about him, that it makes you upset, seeing as you're still in mourning. It's just that you're his widow and… I'm no one's fucking widow. There is no power in the universe that could have enticed me to marry that obnoxious prick, even if he wasn't dead. He looked bewildered. But you had his babies. Linnaea closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I know he was family to you. But he meant absolutely nothing to me. Mourning him? I knew the man for less than an hour, and I'm glad he's dead. Because in that hour, he signed a contract for my body, to carry his baby, before bending me over a dirty table, ripping off my underwear, and ramming his cock into me with zero foreplay. He fucked me for maybe about 5 minutes, grunting the whole time before he was finished. Then he wiped his cock on my dress, smacked me on the bottom, and told me to give him a son or he'd tie me to his bed and fuck me harder next time until I did. Tariq's mouth dropped open. He really did that? Yes, he fucking did. And if I'd known he'd make my first time so fucking painful, I never would have agreed to it. Even if I had spent the last week drinking fertility cocktails, so I'd be certain to conceive. Tariq's fist smacked into his palm. If he wasn't already dead, I'd kill him for that. Your first time and he just… Yep. Did I ever, in all the times was I ever that inconsiderate? Linnaea shook her head. Sex with you has always been amazing. Always. I only wish you'd been my first, instead of him. Now it was Tariq's turn to shake his head. Don't wish for that. If you hadn't slept with him, you wouldn't have your beautiful family. I could never give that to you. Not anymore. He sighed deeply. Why not? I mean, there's nothing wrong with you in the downstairs department. Even as she looked at his groin, it seemed to be hardening. Like he wanted her as much as she wanted him. I'm a ghost, Linnaea. A poltergeist. I can affect things in the corporeal world if I put enough energy behind it, but I'm not corporeal myself. Every time I touch you, it's energy. I didn't even think ghosts could achieve an orgasm, but with you, I can't even walk through walls for a while after I've been with you, my energy levels are so high. But I can't conceive a child with you. The pieces fell into place. That's how you appeared in the creche so easily, and in my apartment too. You walked through the walls, didn't you? He nodded. Sometimes not by choice either. I mean, sometimes I couldn't push enough power into my hands to activate the palm scanner, so I had to walk through the wall when the doors wouldn't open. So why did you keep coming to see me? She asked. That was the one thing that didn't make sense. Well, I felt guilty that you were alone, now Falcon's gone and you needed my help, he began. That kind of explained why he'd stayed in her apartment, helping, for the last few weeks, but it didn't explain all those weeks of hot sex. Most people didn't fuck family. And the sex, she prompted. He ducked his head. I wanted to make it up to you, and then and I wanted, and you wanted, but you were Falcon's widow, so I knew I shouldn't, but I wanted. Linnaea took a deep breath. And now you know I'm not Falcon's widow? What now? I mean, if you were helping me out of guilt these last few weeks, I can absolve you of any of that. I was a willing participant in everything we did together, and you don't owe me anything. You don't owe him anything either. I guess I owe you for all your help. I could pay you for your time if you want, though I can't imagine how much having a full-time doctor in the house for that many weeks would cost. Maybe I could pay you in installments. Tariq held up his hand. You don't owe me anything. Anything I did for you was because I wanted to. I told myself it was because I missed my family, my wife and daughter, who I died protecting, only they went on to whatever waited in the afterlife, while I just got up and went back to work, as a poltergeist, or because I was trying to make up for you losing Falcon, but none of it was the real reason. The real reason I kept coming back to see you, was because I fell in love with you. So hard, so fast, I barely saw it, until I was so deeply in love with you I couldn't stay away. Maya didn't give me your address. I followed her when she came to visit you, then waited in an alley for hours until I'd worked up the courage to come and visit, only my hand went straight through the palm scanner and the wall behind, so the rest of me just sort of followed, and then I saw you were asleep. You can't love me. He laughed. Yeah, I thought that too. Love's just pheromones and chemistry and stuff that needs a corporeal body, but I was wrong. I've been so in love with you, that even though I knew it was wrong to want my cousin's widow, I kept coming to visit you. I couldn't stay away. He sobered. But I will if that's what you want. I was going to buy you a house, you and your kids, so I'd know you'd be taken care of, and then I'd go. Leave you to live your life, being a wonderful mother, and maybe even find love. Because you deserve so much more than me, Linnaea. You deserve all the love the universe has to offer. Not a man who couldn't even protect his family, and then didn't have the courage to move on, because I don't deserve to be with them, when I couldn't save them. I'm not a hero like Maya's husband, Ghost. Linnaea couldn't believe what she was hearing. That's bullshit. You died saving your family, and then got up and kept saving lives. That is a hero, right there. How many lives have you saved as a doctor, as a surgeon? I don't know, he admitted. I just focused on my work, one patient after the other on the Titanic, until we arrived in this system. Ghosts don't need to sleep, you see, so I didn't need to stop. Even when you and the babies were asleep, I kept going because if a poltergeist doesn't have a purpose, we just fade. Into death or the afterlife or nothing at all, I'm not sure, but I couldn't possibly leave while you still need me. I thought if I bought you a house, then maybe. Linnaea's heart constricted in her chest. All those years, poor Tariq. All you want to do is be reunited with your wife and daughter again, but people keep needing you, don't they? Even me. I'm so sorry, Tariq. If I'd known, I don't need you. None of us do. Oh, I want you. I want you to stay forever, for me and my kids. All my life I've wanted to meet Mr. Universe, the perfect man who loved kids. These last few months, I guess I upped my expectations by wanting him to be amazing in bed too, just like you. I bet you'd be an amazing dad, and your little girl was lucky to have you. I mean, how many dads would give their lives to save their kids? I bet there are plenty who'd say they would, but you actually did. Damn it, Tariq, your wife was a lucky woman and I'll forever be jealous of her. Especially if you find a way to be reunited with her, which is absolutely what you deserve, after everything you've done. Tariq shook his head. All this time I thought that was what I wanted. To be with Rhoda and Gulmira again. But they're dead. Their husband and father, he's dead too. I'm not the same man I was then. I've spent more time here in the Alton system than I ever did, married to Rhoda. What I really want now is you. To be part of your family. I told myself I couldn't because of Falcon, but if what you tell me is true, and he really was an asshole for doing that to you, stars Linnaea, all I can think about is how I'd give you your first time all over again. What I'd do differently. Linnaea could feel her knickers becoming very, very damp at the sound of that. At the thought of any kind of sex with Tariq. It had been so long. What would you have done? She asked breathlessly. Well, I'd have laid you on the table first, not bent you over it. And I'd have eased your underwear off, not ripped it off, because you'd have been nervous enough for your first time. I probably would have started with just one finger, rubbing your clit, asking you if you like that, and then Linnaea climbed up on the island benchtop, then lay down. Show me Tariq. He started slow, but Linnaea wasn't a blushing virgin anymore, and it wasn't long before she was begging for more. Well, there is something I've never tried before, because it's something only a poltergeist can do, and only one with a really good knowledge of anatomy, he began. If this were your first time, I could reach inside you, find all of your pleasure centers, and make them ignite all at the same time. At least I think I could. Yes, please, she begged. I've never done this before. She felt a faint tingle as his hands slid beneath her skin, his fingers stretching out across her lower belly until the whole universe dissolved in a crackle of lightning. Hand in hand, Tariq and Linnaea returned to Maya's house. Her cheeks were still flushed pink, but Tariq didn't think anyone but him would notice until they found Maya herself, blocking the way with her hands on her hips. So what did you two decide about the house? She asked. Linnaea must have told her where she'd gone, just as Tariq had. Of course Maya had put two and two together. She was too clever not to. We're going to move in together, once the builder finishes the bathrooms and the kitchens, Linnaea said. I don't suppose you can recommend a good place to buy furniture in the colony? Maya frowned. I think Ghost said the builders made his, out of the same 3D printed synthwood they used to construct the rest of the cabin. You should probably ask them first. She beckoned. Come back to the garden. Everyone's waiting to hear your news. How could Maya possibly know about the proposal he'd gasped out, right before Linnaea's sixth orgasm on top of the kitchen bench, or how she'd screamed her acceptance as she came? Stars take it, he'd wanted to get Linnaea a ring before they made a public announcement, but with all eyes on them, Tariq knew he wasn't going to be able to wait. Linnaea and I are engaged, he announced before anyone could ask. Cheers and applause greeted them, though he saw some money change hands too. People would bet on anything. Flora leaned closer to the fawn sitting beside her, and nudged him. Would you consider getting a house here in the Arbor Dome, near Linnaea? The fawn snorted. Hardly. You might be able to afford it, but I couldn't, and besides, you'd never leave Star Farm. You'd rather your kids snacked on all your hydroponic crops instead of climbing trees, and I'm more than happy to support you in that. When they kissed, more applause erupted. Until someone blurted out, Flora, are you pregnant? Flora turned brick red. Not yet, though we're getting in plenty of practice for when we do want to start a family. Aren't we all? Someone else shouted, to much laughter. All of us except Achilles, piped up the dragon shifter beside Achilles. A near relative, Tariq guessed, judging by the similarity of their features. He's going to remain a grumpy bachelor forever, because, who wants to spend their life with a grumpy, territorial dragon anyway? Everyone laughed except for the woman sitting beside Achilles, who stared at him as though she'd never seen him before, turned a dangerous shade of pale, and hurried off. Who was that? Linnaea asked. Tariq peered closely at the departing woman. I think that's Dr. Paris, the psychologist in charge of the colony's mental health team. We're relatively quiet at the hospital because most people in the colony are in good physical health, but as far as mental health goes, well, we're a star system full of refugees and war veterans. Everyone's got issues, and there aren't enough trained counselors to go around. She probably had to go back to work. Something to mention to the colony administration, when he had a moment. The mental health team was responsible for taking care of the rest of the colony, but who took care of them? Linnaea nudged his knee. So when do you have to go back to work? Or will you have time to help me move house when our place is ready? Tariq grinned. Well, as your partner, I'll qualify for full parental leave, the same as you. Plus, I have a few decades of annual leave and time in lieu saved up, from all the time I worked on the trip over here, while everyone else was in stasis. So, how about until our kids start school? Or maybe even finish it? Linnaea laughed. You seriously want to be a stay-at-home dad? After being a doctor and a surgeon and saving so many lives? I only did it because I couldn't be a dad anymore. Now you're giving me a second chance with your 3 kids. I'd be stupid to waste a moment. The hospital can call me in as a consultant if they need me. The rest of my time is yours, now and forever. Linnaea smiled and snuggled up to him. I like the sound of that. So did Tariq. He wasn't sure he deserved what the universe was giving him, letting him share his life with this beautiful woman and her family, but he intended to seize them all with both hands, and never let go. Dark. An alien sci-fi romance. Book 7 in the Colony, Nick series. Written by Demelza Carlton.